In chapter 1091, Monkey D. Luffy leapt into battle combat against Kizaru, greeting him with a kick in the something and stating, "Kizaru, compared to 2 years ago, we're 100 times stronger now." Which is a line that often goes over the heads of many One Piece fans because, to be fair, it is a reference to a line that was stated 15 years of publishing time prior by Shaki, who, when referring to her on-again, off-again husband, Silver's Rayleigh, said, "He's about 100 times stronger than you boys." And this becomes extra meaningful because during that arc we were treated to a glimpse of the abilities of Dark King Silver's Rayleigh, where he triumphantly appears to put a halt to Marine Admiral Kizaru with a powersome old man kick, after which point Luffy shouts, "Old man," because that's what he is, as the Straw Hats proceed to be completely decimated in front of Luffy's eyes. And I can tell you that even all the way back then, what Eiichiro Oda was thinking about was the day where Luffy would be able to proudly state that he is now on that level. What Rayleigh said to Kizaru was, "Don't pick the buds before they sprout. Their era is only just beginning." And it's only during Egghead Island that we could officially say that those buds had bloomed, as Luffy finally took on the role of Rayleigh against Kizaru. And Oda even had Luffy initially kick Kizaru just as Rayleigh did, proudly stating, "Compared to 2 years ago, we're 100 times stronger now." It's a great line from Luffy, it's a fantastic callback in general from Eiichiro Oda, and it's a huge reward for the readers and watchers who have been following One Piece for 15 years, ever so slowly building to this moment. And yet, with all of that, very few people recognize the true weight of this line. There are very few times in One Piece where Oda elects to directly power scale, and this is also not one of them. What both Luffy and Shaki said about power and 100 and times was not to be taken as a literal measure, and once you understand that, it opens up a whole new level of understanding of exactly what Oda was doing on Egghead Island and just how frustratingly brilliant this line was. To me, this line is one of the most satisfying things that Luffy has said in all of post-time skip One Piece, and the entirety of Egghead Island was constructed around this line because it is an arc of contrast. When Luffy first encountered Kizaru, it was right after he'd been labeled as one of the supernova or the super rookies, depending on the translation, and so this first meeting was when Luffy was right at the very bottom of the pirate hierarchy. He just made enough of a fuss for people to bother to learn his name, whereas the second time he met Kizaru was right after Luffy was undisputedly declared as one of the 4 emperors and had officially hit the ceiling of the pirating world. Yes, Luffy plans on shooting beyond that to become the Pirate King, but as far as respect for pirates on this planet goes, there is currently no higher status than Emperor. So the contrast of status is quite mind-blowing. The second time that Luffy met Kizaru, his name was undeniable. He went from no one to the only one. And not only that, but this time around, Kizaru even recognized Luffy as the man who possessed the powers of Nika, which draws an even more insane contrast, as on Sabaody Kizaru was effectively a god to Luffy, and on Egghead, Luffy was a god to Kizaru in a much closer to literal fashion. This is the sort of thing I mean when I say it's not just about being mathematically 100 times more punch powerful. This whole statement is a measure of impossibility. Shaki may as well have stated 1,000, 10,000, or even 100,000 times stronger. The exact number itself doesn't really matter. What matters is that the number was big enough to create an impossible gap between the bottom of the world and the top of the world, a gap which Luffy has since managed to bridge. And within the One Piece fanbase, there is this one fantastic, perfect image that was made to showcase this. It's probably my favorite thing that fictional pirate appreciators on the internet have ever done, and it is a split screen of Luffy lamenting his weakness after the Paramount War, coupled with embracing his peakness after awakening his devil fruit. "I'm still so weak" versus "this is my peak" are the two extremes that Luffy has felt during his journey, and both of them were marked by the metric of Kizaru. But because the 100 times stronger line was said in the context of Luffy versus Kizaru one-on-one, I do again think that the full weight of this line isn't felt by a lot of people. Because Luffy doesn't just say that he's 100 times stronger. No. He says we're 100 times stronger. And at this point, after Wano, each of the Straw Hats has followed Luffy across that impossible gap. Mr. Swordsman Zoro is probably the most straightforward example. He stepped onto Egghead Island after having just beaten King Kaido second in command and taking the world stage for the very first time, which isn't something I say to just verbally wank him off. It's something I say because Oda crafted a very purposeful moment with Marco tapping out of the world stage and instead announcing the arrival of Zoro and Sanji, the new stars to take the stage. Remembering that Marco was the second in command of the world's strongest man. That is the status that Zoro now occupies, and we'll get to Sanji in a bit. But the other reason why it was important for Oda to use Marco specifically is because he is the man who put up the best fight against Kizaru during the Paramount War. Marco fought this admiral and they were portrayed as more or less equal. So it is a very big deal to have Marco relinquish his position and for Zoro to now step onto Egghead Island with the same status that Marco casually flew into Marineford with. And there's also another development for Zoro which took place right before the Kizaru arrival. Zoro briefly fought against S-Hawk and, at least according to the anime filler, even beat S-Hawk, which is pretty huge, because he is a mini Mihawk. And pre-time skip, after being trounced by Kizaru, Zoro had to bow his head to Mihawk and beg the world's greatest swordsman to train him. But now he is on Egghead Island, comfortably taking on an incarnation of the world's greatest. And so Zoro has also bridged this impossible gap. And also not to be neglected is Nico Robin, who has spent most of her life being labeled as a demon by the world government, despite the fact that she was very, very human and quite fragile. However, during the raid on Onigashima, Robin finally embraced the status that she was cursed with by the world government, creating the mighty demonio form and rising to become someone truly worthy of the fear that the world government itself engineered. In Robin's case, it's much less about physical power though, and there's some of that. But it's more that the closer she gets to finding all of those fun mystery cubes, the poneglyph, and discovering the true history of the world, then the more that demon comes to fruition. It's at the point now where it's even manifested into a physical form, with Robin choosing the underworld as her path to cross the boundary of the impossible. Meanwhile, Usopp has gone in the exact opposite direction, ascending to the status of God Usopp, which is a pretty massive jump for someone whose name wasn't even known pre-time skip. And when redesigning the Straw Hats for the post-time skip era, Eiichiro Oda was very conscious about elevating Usopp's status. At one point, he was even considering a design giving Usopp a crown, and perhaps having him take on the moniker of King of the Snipers, telling a grand story of how during his harsh 2 years of training, he challenged Saga King to a one-on-one snipe battle and managed to defeat the King of Sniper Island and thus take the title for himself. But what we eventually got was so much more than a mere king. Usopp went from not even being recognized as a mortal pre-time skip to having the epithet of God. So if anyone is worthy of Luffy's words, it has to be Usopp. And this status upgrade also applies to Brook, who was an unknown solo musician forgotten by time, and has since become a global superstar whose music is so well known that he even has at least one member of the Holy Knights listening to it. You know, other than Luffy, Brook is probably the biggest publicly known name on the Straw Hat crew right now. His strength, yes, it's grown quite modestly, but Brook's influence has become immeasurably more powerful. But I did say we'd expand more on Sanji, and I've saved him for here because he's one of the best and most well-explored examples. He was being held back by his emotional binds with his family, which he overcame not during Whole Cake Island, but during Wano, when he accepted his heritage by using the raid suit, even if it was to spy on women bathing, still used it, but more importantly by defeating Queen, a former colleague of his father Vinsmoke Judge, and someone who had every power possessed by Sanji's family members. Beating up Queen was Sanji literally kicking the crap out of a dinosaur, but metaphorically, it was him finally freeing himself from the shackles of his family. And in doing so, he also gained access to the true power that he was born with. The modifications that Judge implanted into his mother are now accessible to Sanji, and they're a pretty big deal, literally transforming him and skyrocketing all of his abilities. And so if we're going with the purely literal interpretation of Luffy's line, then it would be Sanji who is the Straw Hat who has well and truly earned the status of being called 100 times stronger, even going so far as to comfortably tank a punch to the face from S-Shark as if it was absolutely nothing. And S-Shark is of course a clone of Straw Hat helmsman Jinbe, and his presence is more indicative of the evolution that the crew have gone through than anyone else's. During Thriller Bark, Charlotte Gecko Moria made a very big deal about Luffy defying the warlords, and that's because Moria was holding on to that title as his own personal status ceiling. And Moria actually gave Luffy several warnings about that nasty, nasty new world. With your strength, you'll just die anyway if you continue on your voyage. You're not fit for the new world. It seems you have a couple of good underlings, but you'll lose them all. Straw Hat, you think you can? Then go. You think things have been tough so far? The real nightmare is waiting in the new world. Which is all the more poignant considering that Moria was Luffy's final pre-time skip victory over a main antagonist before before running into the wall that Gecko Moria had so kindly informed him about. So Moria set the ceiling for us, or he built the wall for it, whichever metaphor you want to use. Moria did it. And whatever it is, it's a thing that the Straw Hats hit immediately in the very next arc and proved Moria's words. However, by Egghead Island, Luffy has gone so far beyond anything that Moria could ever have dreamed, straight through that ceiling wall, and now with Jinbe, Luffy even has a warlord serving him, which does also draw a nice comparison to Whitebeard, because Jinbe has the same sort of loyalty to Luffy as he did with Edward Newgate. Jinbe was essentially considered part of Whitebeard's extended crew, so it is a very powerful statement when Jinbe chooses to serve Luffy after having served the world's strongest man, and also after having served Big Mom. That's a pretty big deal as well. But again, when Luffy says we're 100 times stronger compared to 2 years ago, it encompasses everything that the Straw Hats have worked so hard to become over the past 15 years of real-world publishing time, and it's a line that only hits as hard as it does because of the very lengthy journey we've gone through as readers to earn that status. If Luffy had said this right after the time skip, yeah, it would have been a cool callback, but it wouldn't have been earned. However, this theme goes a lot deeper than just comparing then and now, because at the very heart of Egghead Island, it's all about Bartholomew Kuma, who also obeys the very basic motif of contrast during the arc. His Sabati performance showcased a man acting as an emotionless cyborg, whereas Egghead was all about the feelings of this now fully transitioned emotionless cyborg. He couldn't stop emotioning, and apparently emotion does still exist within his lifeless shell, which kicked into gear to save his daughter Bonnie from Spider-Man Saint Saturn. There's also a lot of questions about what constitutes life and also what constitutes freedom. Bartholomew Kuma is a man who appeared to be free on Sabati with this insane devil fruit power that allowed him to travel anywhere on the planet, but he was completely trapped, and arguably much more free during Egghead, when he theoretically had had all of his free will stripped away from him. So the Kuma contrast, like everything else, very strong. But Kuma is also by far the greatest benefactor of the Straw Hats, having sent all of them to the most perfect of islands for them to learn and train to survive and thrive in the new world and become the crew they are on Egghead Island. Although the only reason why he had all of those locations ready to go was because of Bonnie. Kuma scoured the entire planet, desperately hunting for a cure for his daughter's sapphire scales, and ended up unintentionally discovering exactly what each and every member of the Straw Hats needed to grow. And that's also why a lot of other familiar Sabati elements come full circle on Egghead. Not just Kizaru, but also Sentomaru, who's really only explored in these 2 arcs in the series, and so he too has a nice contrast happening. Originally, he was an impenetrable wall standing against us, but on Egghead, he becomes a stalwart yet definitely penetrable wall standing in our defense. And you can say the same for the Pacifista as well. On Sabati, the Straw Hats had to pull out everything they had to bring down a single Kumabot. Everyone had to use their ultimate techniques, and they still barely only brought one of them down. But then on Egghead, we're not even fighting them anymore. Instead, they are fighting for us. The army of Mark III Pacifista were deployed against the Buster Call, and very directly against the world government, as the 5 elders had to appear on the island to personally deal with them. And in many ways, Oda's choice to focus on the story of Bonnie and Kuma during this arc is a reciprocal event due to what happened 2 years ago in Sabati. During that time, Kuma used his final act to save our crew, and on Egghead, they used the power and status they gained as a result of Kuma to protect and liberate his daughter, which is a very important idea in and of itself. When the Straw Hats were separated was Luffy's greatest despair, the sense that he couldn't even protect his own crew. Then Ace died, and that was bad. It really made it seem like Luffy was completely powerless to protect anything. So the very idea of Jewelry Bonnie was quite high stakes narratively when we're being confronted with all of these same elements that resulted in Luffy's greatest narrative low, and even more. What happened on Egghead Island was so much worse than anything we'd ever faced before, as there was also a Buster Call ordered on the island to be carried out by the single largest fleet ever assembled within the Marines in a single time. When these chapters were coming out weekly, I really tried to stress this as much as I could, but there were 100 ships sent to Egghead, which is significantly more firepower than the Marines had even during the Paramount War, although it was less manpower. Across those 100 ships, Egghead had 30,000 Marines deployed, whilst the Paramount War had 100,000 stationed. Still, you're talking about taking on a third of the Paramount War Marines. Almost perfectly as well, because we had 1 admiral instead of 3. So about a third of the forces that were required to deal with Whitebeard. That is what the Straw Hats had to overcome. In addition to the presence of Cypher Pole, quite specifically Rob Lucci. He's not on a lot of people's Egghead highlight reels, but he's extremely important in showing that direct then and now comparison. Previously, I stated that Gecko Moria had established our pre-time skip ceiling, but it would be more accurate to say that he pointed it out. Because Rob Lucci was the pre-time skip antagonist who pushed Luffy to his absolute maximum limit, with Luffy still managing to win. Whereas Moria more or less defeated himself by eating far too many delicious shadow dinners and repeatedly getting whacked in the tum-tum. So Rob Lucci is an incredibly important measuring tool to have with us on Egghead, as he was the maximum height that Luffy could surpass pre-time skip. So watching Luffy absolutely clown Rob Lucci early on during Egghead, and subsequently also watching Lucci get passed on to an eager for sloppy second Zoro, is also quite the statement of how far we've come in and of itself. And also there's this something so amazing that I think the anime absolutely nailed, whereas the manga kinda fumbled. In the digitally colored manga, the whole defeat at Sabaody takes place in bright sunny daylight. However, in the anime, they made a decision that the Straw Hats being defeated on Sabaody was to happen during a sunset. So as the Straw Hats disappeared one by one, the sun was disappearing from the world. And by the time Luffy was gone, the sun had disappeared. However, when Luffy met Kizaru on Egghead, it was right at the beginning of a new dawn after the evening on Egghead. And so a lot happened during that one symbolic night that took 15 years to work through. However, we are now well and truly awake and bringing the sunrise with us as the dawn of the world approaches. Miss Jinny is a very special One Piece character. She doesn't just exist so that Eiichiro Oda can emotionally milk you like the moist crag cow you are. No. Jinny is one of the most important people who has ever been born in this fictional world, and every moment of modern day One Piece has been framed by her impressive and unbelievably large legacy shadow. Be it God Valley, the Straw Hat separation, Vegapunk's message on Egghead Island, the Vegapunk satellites themselves, and even the upcoming Dawn of the World. None of that would have been possible without Jinny. And the first thing I should really say about Jinny is that, special though she may be, she does fall pretty admittedly perfectly into the flashback trope, which isn't a bad thing. The word trope, it often has very negative connotations, but that's only if you use a trope badly, in which case it often becomes a cliche. Oda writes flashback characters inherently differently to his modern day characters. They tend to appear as more infallible archetypes, designed as solid walls of willpower to inspire the characters whose will they go on to inherit. And this is also done because these characters are portrayed through the perspective of the memory of the person having the flashback, which is generally someone they were very close to, and so they remember them very well. Oftentimes, our tragic flashback figures are presented as almost embodiments of perfection, empathy, and compassion, and characters that don't really have any flaws. There are, of course, exceptions to this. Think Belmez slapping Nami is a good case of a flashback character being shown to have a very human flaw. But for the most part, our precious memories are very idealized figures, and that's exactly why they're painted this way, because flashback figures are presented to us through the memories of those who they were most important to. Quite literally in the case of Kuma and Jinny, actually, everything we see of Jinny is given to us through the framing device of Bonnie viewing Kuma's literal memories. Even the stuff he wasn't there for, like Jinny being abducted in East Blue, so that is a very impressive memory. But the reason why I bring this up is because Jinny is a particularly potent exploration of this. Jinny was designed by Oda to be a perfect memory. Everything we see of Jinny is perfect because that is how Bartholomew Kuma saw her, and anything that would damage that perception is censored, such as Oda very purposely never showing us Jinny's face during her death scene in the church. We do get a glimpse of her hand and her foot, both riddled with sapphire scales, enough to trigger the imagination into conjuring an image of what it was like, but we're never directly confronted with the reality of Jinny's final moments. We're only ever shown Jinny at her best because that is how Kuma remembers her, and also because this was out of respect for Jinny's last wishes. After escaping from the Holy Land, she contacts the Revolutionary Army and says, "I'm back, Kumachi, back to the lower world. I got sick. See, they didn't want me anymore. They dumped me off. Lucky me, huh? I really wish I could see you all, but this is me saying goodbye. I'm sorry, Kumachi. I'm dying. It won't be long now. I appreciate your concern, but don't come looking for me. And Kumachi, just remember, I'll always love you." Jinny didn't want Kuma to see what he'd become. Jinny wanted Kuma to remember her how she was. And even when Kuma's staring at her dead body, all he can think about and all we are shown are the moments of Jinny at her happiest. And this perfect memory idea was illustrated in chapter 1098, an extremely unique chapter in One Piece history, as the art style for this chapter is a little bit different and unintentionally brilliant. In 1098, for the first time in One Piece history, Eiichiro Oda did not finish drawing his pages in time for publication. And in cases like this, Weekly Shonen Jump does not delay the publication, they just run with what they they have. And some manga are more affected by this policy than others. Jujutsu Kaisen is probably the best modern day example. The author Gege Akutami had frequent health issues and often had to submit unfinished pages that were then completed for volume release. And Hunter x Hunter would be the other most prominent example in manga history. But here's the thing about when this happened in One Piece. Because it had never happened before in 26 years, a lot of weekly readers actually thought that this was a stylistic choice being made by Oda, that we were stepping into such a deep, dark part of Kuma's memories that this vision was becoming more sketchy and blurry as a result of Kuma's emotional trauma. And honestly, I do think that works well enough as an explanation. If any chapter had to be submitted in this state, this is the perfect one to do it. Although we do know that it wasn't on purpose because it was published with an apology from Eiichiro Oda, and the art has been subsequently completed and released in volume 108. However, for those of us reading weekly, it oddly enhanced the experience of Jinny's final moments in a way that no other flashback character has had, and in a way that no one will likely ever have again because it was a mistake to begin with. However, Jinny's overall impact on One Piece is far greater than one tragic scene in one tragically drawn chapter, and she's one of Oda's most well thought out flashback figures, which can be seen right from her introduction. One idea that I strongly advocate for in a lot of my videos is the idea of food theory, which is Eiichiro Oda telling us everything we need to know about a certain character through their relationship and interaction with food. And that's because in One Piece, food is often equated directly to life. So how one interacts with food tells you how they value life. As a quick example, Helmeppo stepping on Rika's onigiri during Shellstown tells us that he is a wasteful, inconsiderate man who doesn't understand or care about the true value of life. Whilst Mr. Swordman Zoro eating that same dirt-riddled, ruined onigiri tells us that he is a very grateful and considerate person who very much values life in whatever form it comes. So one of the quickest and most effective tools that Oda has to make us like a character is to draw a scene of them eating. And so Jinny is very purposely introduced in quite a Luffy-like way, eating meat straight off the bone with a big old smile that only looks small in comparison to the mega face of Emporio Ivankov standing next to her. But we don't feel the true power of this until the next chapter, where we have a scene of Kuma and Jinny eating together, and Jinny starts breaking down into tears of happiness because she's full. Jinny's been a starving slave her whole life, and now something that most people would consider fulfilling a basic human need makes her the happiest she has ever been in her life. It's not just about making us like a character though. Jinny's relationship with food in particular is used as a through line for Kuma's story. One particularly touching moment is when Kuma's giving Bonnie a bottle of milk and she's labeled a quote champion drinker, which makes Kuma think back to how insatiable Jinny was. And it even makes Kuma cry because it's like a piece of Jinny is still alive and well within Bonnie. It's a very lovely bonding moment between father and newborn baby. And one of the most memorable events that occurs later on is Bonnie's pizza party. One of the happiest moments of her life where she looks very Jinny-esque, right down to the stars in her eyes. And it's such a joyous occasion that even Kizaru is having an uncharacteristically good time. But all of that only works because of Oda's fixation on implementing food theory with his characters. To bookend Jinny's memory, the last time we as readers see Jinny's face before tragedy strikes is a close-up of her with a bone in her mouth, just like the first time we saw her. She's also quite emotionally simplistic. Child Jinny shared so many Luffy qualities that it briefly ignited a crazy and stupid theory that Jinny was Luffy's mother and that Bonnie was his sister. Thankfully, that didn't turn out to be true because I'm not quite sure how Oda would have sold a romance with Dragon, but he did do quite well with Jinny and Kuma. This is worth pointing out because Oda is generally not a big fan of writing romance in any incarnation. At all times, he tries to keep in mind that his readers are mostly teenage boys, and in the early days of One Piece, what that meant was that romance more or less didn't even exist in the One Piece world. However, over the decades, Oda has matured. He's gotten married, he's started a family, he's felt the feelings, and so he's been pretty consistently working small elements of romance into One Piece without ever really committing to it. And Kuma and Jinny are a fantastic example of this because after they reach a certain age, Kuma starts asking Jinny to marry her at every given opportunity, and Kuma always refuses, which is quite sad because it's not that he doesn't want to marry Jinny, it's because he's well aware of his Buccaneer blood, and he doesn't want to curse Jinny with that should they have a child together, because that's what happened with his parents. His father had Buccaneer blood, his mother was a regular human, and that ended in a big old tragedy for all of them. So by keeping his legal distance from Jinny, Kuma believes that he is guarding her from an inevitable fate of pure misery, although unfortunately she would go on to experience that and worse regardless. But it's a very clever writing solution by Oda here. He can't just ignore the idea of romance altogether, but he's come up with a feasible reason for why things never really developed. Although I'd also argue that what he's trying to do with Kuma and Jinny is portray portray an idea of love that goes well beyond romance. Kuma and Jinny don't need to be shown kissing and smushing their faces together on screen for us to know how much they deeply, deeply care about each other. But we should also recognize that this is Oda smithing a very special knife to stab and twist into our insides. Because after years of asking, Jinny did eventually get married. However, it was forcibly married to a world noble after she was abducted. And I think that a lot of authors in this situation would have been tempted to have Kuma and Jinny get married during the happy times, regardless of the incoming tragedy. But Oda is an author who is incredibly keenly aware of contrast. And there is a massive contrast between Kuma, the pure and true love refusing marriage, and the unknown world noble with the twisted and not at all love forcing marriage. It's just another in a large pile of elements that Oda uses to separate Kuma from the world nobles, as well as to make Jinny's tragedy hit that much harder by taking her dream and corrupting it into a nightmare. I've started to say this a lot more after this flashback in particular was published, but Eiichiro Oda, as much as he is seen as some grand champion of optimism, is an absolute master of engineering horrible, horrible despair. His mind is just so capable of working in very troubling ways. Although some fans do read a platonic layer between Kuma and Jinny, primarily because of the shirt she starts wearing at the age of 21, hilariously implying that Kuma may have sister-zoned Jinny, although this is more than likely a reference to nuns due to Kuma's Christian saint motif. And because Jinny resides within a church, she's given that as well. With sister being more like how nuns refer to each other, although Jinny does display very sisterly qualities as well. Jinny does recognize that even though Kuma is bigger and stronger than her, she is 4 years older than him and does feel that need to protect and provide for Kuma, which as she grows up turns Jinny into quite an abrasive personality. There's quite a distinct switch from Luffy-style innocence to a more Nami-style cynicism. And to the people of the Sorbet Kingdom, Jinny appears to be an unsympathetic, money-driven grump because she's constantly trying to limit the amount of time and space available for Kuma to perform his healing miracles. But that's because she's doing what she can to protect Kuma, knowing that all of the pain he takes away from others has to be borne by himself. The elderly of the Sorbet Kingdom view Kuma's abilities as a blessing, as does Kuma himself, but Jinny sees his devil fruit abilities equally as a curse. And this hits pretty hard when you see just how much Kuma suffers as a result of taking away the aches and pains of the elderly. It results in the creation of a pain bubble almost the exact same size as the one that Zoro had to endure in Thriller Bark, and Kuma does that on a weekly basis. And as much as that physically destroys Kuma, it mentally destroys Jinny as she falls to the ground crying during every session. And I think that she feels a fair bit of direct responsibility for that, because Jinny was the one who orchestrated the plan that resulted in Kuma eating the pawpaw fruit to begin with. However, even though her time in the series was quite short, Jinny is one of the most important people who has ever been born in this world. I often credit her as being the single most responsible individual for the God Valley incident, as Jinny discovered the prize as being awarded for the native hunting competition by wiretapping snails and then rebroadcasting this throughout the world with the hope that, quote, maybe someone heard it. And someone did, many someones. And not only did it lead directly to her liberation, but also the defeat of Rox D, completely changing world history as we know it. And Jinny's impact following that also shouldn't be underestimated, as she was given a 190 million berry bounty by the world government, so they saw Jinny as almost twice as much of a threat as they saw Luffy after he defeated Crocodile. And Jinny was also worth more than a big chunk of the worst generation were pre-time skip. She was a pretty big deal, but the brilliance of Jinny isn't seen through her actions or her impact on Kuma or even with the legacy of Bonnie. The legacy of Jinny is well and truly still alive in this world, not just through Bonnie, but Jinny lives on through the work of Dr. Vegapunk. Vegapunk studied Kuma's memories, and he based his mission for world peace around everything that is Kuma. That's most obvious with the Pacifista, but what's a little bit more subtle is Jinny's inspiration. Vegapunk took on Jinny's qualities for his own satellites, with Atlas's appearance being heavily inspired by Jinny taking her hairstyle, and Atlas in particular embodies Kuma's memory of Jinny as a child, hence why Atlas is a giant child. And Atlas is also the aspect of violence, with Jinny being known to be quite quick to anger and violence when she was a child. And you can also see quite a lot of Jinny within York. They both have the same smile, they both got freckles under their eyes, and York was chosen to be the aspect of greed and avatar of gluttony, which was Jinny's favorite vice to indulge in, as well as one that she passed on to Bonnie. Plus, when Jinny grows up and joins the Revolutionary Army, she also adopts a pair of goggles like York has. And I'd also add Lilith into this discussion because she does strongly resemble older Jinny. However, I'm not sure if this is as intentional as Atlas and York. It's quite likely that Lilith and Jinny look alike because they both share Oda's very standard female design. Although I will say that Lilith is the Vegapunk who's most concerned with money. Jinny, which was a trait that Jinny displayed, but only because of her concern for Kuma. And I do have a fair bit of trouble connecting the idea of evil to Jinny, but also in the end, Lilith is a much more playful idea of evil. And there is definitely something to be said for the idea that Lilith is now the one with a mission to set up a lab to fix Kuma, which is a very Jinny legacy to inherit. After Kuma took his weekly dose of pain bubbles, Jinny was the one sitting by his side and nursing him to recovery, and now Lilith is the one by his side, scientifically nursing him back to humanity. So the legacy of Jinny continues to live on in exactly the way she would have wanted it to, by caring for Kuma. In fact, it's quite a vicious cycle of care, with Jinny caring for Kuma, then Kuma caring for Bonnie, who was what remained of Jinny, and now we're on to Lilith, who was potentially inspired by Jinny, caring for what remains of Kuma. So I do think it's quite plausible that Vegapunk modeled all of his female satellites on Jinny in their respective ways. And not only that, but the culmination of Vegapunk's life was also inspired by Jinny, because something that I don't think many people pick up on is the influence that Jinny's God Valley actions would have on this world 38 years later on Egghead Island. Again, Jinny's plan was to broadcast the truth of what was happening on that island to anyone who would listen, mainly the prizes, and to kickstart the hope of someone appearing on the island to change their fate, which worked. And so it's not all surprising that Vegapunk used that core concept and did the same thing with his Dead Man switch, activating a global broadcast to reveal the truth of the world that he discovered in the hope of changing the current trajectory of history. I'm not saying that Vegapunk wouldn't have been smart enough to do this without having seen Jinny do it in Kuma's memories, but when a writer executes the same idea twice in the same arc with the same themes, it's likely because there's an intention to have them linked. And at the very least, Jinny has had one of the greatest effects on the world because her actions saved Bartholomew Kuma, whose actions saved the Straw Hats, whose actions are eventually going to save the entire world. And every moment of modern day One Piece has actually been framed by the hopes of an optimistic child slave longing for liberation. Is science bad? Well, if fictional pirate comic One Piece is to be believed, then science has not traditionally been portrayed as a force for good, which is epitomized by the world's warrior god of science being a very evil demonic spider devil. But even before we got to him, One Piece has had a pretty troubling history with science. On Thriller Bark, we met one of the world's most renowned of sciencemen, Dr. Hogback, and what he did right was he dug up the corpse of a woman he was stalking and reanimated her into his plate slave. Score 1 for science and less than 1 for general morality. Caesar Clown on Punk Hazard was contracted by Charlotte Linlin to perform gigantification experiments on children, but decided to piss that money away on implied escorts, and used what little he had left over to perform the research in the most brutal and inhumane way possible. Then we have Queen, real name Cyan, as in science, who pursued this science for his hobby of creating new and fun diseases to kill people in ever interestingly new and unusual ways. Meanwhile, Vince Smoke Judge elected to genetically alter his own children to strip away their emotions and turn them into efficient killing machines. Miss Buckingham Stussy cloned herself and cloned her alleged lover in order to serve as her son, and Dr. Indigo farts whenever he walks, which is really annoying to do for an entire movie. And finally, the aforementioned J. Garcia Saturn, the epitome of the evil of science, dedicated his research purely to systematically dismantling the human race. Science has a bit of a rough history in One Piece, and even Dr. Vegapunk, the goodest of the good science men, was not immune from this. Again, he is the most nicest of science men, but even he recognizes the base desire for greed, violence, and evil within him, and saw fit to give each of those impulses their own body to carry out said impulses. And Oda chose Egghead Island as the arc to explore his complicated feelings about science, approaching the discussion from two polar opposite beliefs with Vegapunk and Saint Saturn. One of the biggest differences between these two men is that Vegapunk, despite his status, always refers to himself as but a humble scientist. He uses this language a lot, such as when he apologized to Bonnie, calling himself nothing more than a hired scientist, as opposed to J. Garcia Saturn, who claims to be, and genuinely believes himself to be, a god. So the two have fundamentally different approaches to science. Vegapunk, as a humble man, has great respect for the wonders of the world around him, while Saturn has great disdain for that same world. The two are also a tale of resources. There's a common theme with the Vegapunk stating how under-resourced they are, and how much they're they're able to produce despite that, while Saint Saturn has effectively infinite resources and manages to produce nothing of worth. In fact, he creates negative value. Saturn used the infinite resources available to him to research and implement the suffering of a single man, whilst Vegapunk used his limited resources to benefit all mankind. Vegapunk is also generally inspired by the good of those around him. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for creating GP flowers, which convert gunpowder into flowers and prevent the firing of weapons. And as of right now, the only character we know of who uses these would be Hibari. But this right here is a big step towards world peace by forcibly disarming combatants. And decades later, Vegapunk would switch his focus to bubble tech, inventing bubble shields for the pacifista and bubble guns to capture and pacify people within bubbles. And he chose Bartholomew Kuma to be the basis of his pacifista peace project. He even named them after Kuma, labeling himself as a pacifist, and even hiring Sentomaru as a bodyguard who claims to have the world's greatest defense. Everything that Vegapunk does is for the pursuit of peace and protection, which is awkward because he's being employed by a man charged with achieving the opposite. If Vegapunk pursues science to protect all mankind and see it prosper, then Saturn practices science for the sake of exterminating humans. Think of human lives as nothing more than insects. They will always breed more to make up for any loss, and one of the few times we do see Saturn express any kind of regret is when the pacifista are ordered to eliminate the Sea Beast weapons. This makes Saturn somewhat sad because the Sea Beasts were exceptional weapons that could have been put to fantastic exterminatory use. And there is a real strong temptation to view the dynamic of Vegapunk and Saturn as good versus evil, man we like versus man we really don't like, but that is not the case at all. And Jewelry Bonnie says as much when she reunites with Vegapunk, stating, "Your endless quest for scientific knowledge will spare no one in its greed," which in retrospect was some pretty amazing foreshadowing for York's betrayal by specifically flagging that greed was the issue. And Bonnie was obviously saying this because at the time she blamed Vegapunk for what happened to her father. But here's the thing, she's not wrong. Vegapunk may have had good intentions at heart, but he is not morally exempt at all. In fact, I would describe him as more morally abstaining. Yes, he does try to do the right thing whenever he's actively in control, but it's the secondary effects of his actions which can often have devastating consequences. The development of the pacifista, Vegapunk's Legion of Peace. This peace force have quelled and killed countless people since they were created and put in the hands of the world government. Then Vegapunk's discovery of the lineage factor was a massive breakthrough, but it was also one that opened a very dangerous door that a lot of nefarious individuals rushed through, such as Vince Smoke Judge using it to alter his own children, or Caesar clumsily using the concept to try and gigantify children for Big Mom. Even the more simple stuff like figuring out how to align the bottom of marine ships with sea stone so they can travel through the calm belt, at first that seems harmless. It's just an extension of freedom, but what it's done is it has allowed the world government a significant strategic advantage that no other force can measure up to and increased their stranglehold on the planet. And Vegapunk also has the responsibility of Leloucia on his rather massive head, as yes, York is the one who stole a sample of the Mother Flame and gave it to the elders, allowing the ancient weapon Uranus to be used on the Leloucia kingdom, but York literally is Vegapunk. She's not a completely separate entity. Everything present within her also exists within him, and it's just like Jewelry Bonnie said, your endless quest will spare no one in its greed. Earlier when I was drawing a contrast to Saturn, I was also tempted to make the point that Saturn experiments on unwilling subjects like Jinny, whereas Vegapunk makes a point of asking for consent like he did with Kuma. However, I'm not sure if that argument still stands with the existence of the Seraphim, 6 of which were created from the DNA of people who had not consented to be cloned, much less have those clones turned into weaponized servants with no free will of their own. Ownership of DNA is one of those debates that even we as a society still have yet to properly do, and I don't think that Eiichiro Oda intended to take part in that discussion with his fictional pirate comic. If he did, I would think that Jinbe would have had a much stronger reaction to seeing S-Shark. As it is, he's just a bit shocked and highly amused at S-Snake and how much she resembles Boa Hancock's personality. But fictionally, realistically, he'd probably have quite a strong reaction to a fishman being cloned for the purpose of effectively being a slave, given the history of his people. And one of Vegapunk's other more questionable dreams has to do with punk records, a big old library that people could continue to update long after he's gone. To which Jinbe quickly asked whether that would be an issue if this power was put in the wrong hands and this library was corrupted by an ideology, because in that case you would be able to control the world's supply of knowledge and weaponize it for that given ideology. And that's essentially what's happened in the One Piece world already. The world government has a near monopoly on knowledge to the point where they have managed to edit out a whole century's worth of history and then lie and insert their own ideological history as time has gone on. But in response to this concern, Vegapunk says, "Well, Jinbe, for first son of the sea? That's a very smart question to be asking. But science will never advance if you spend all of your time worrying about it, so just don't worry, mate. Stop asking questions. Which I personally don't find to be a very comforting answer. But that is the Vegapunk philosophy, which he makes clear in his message to the world, where he refuses to opine over which side was good and which side was evil. That is not for science to decide. And that makes the dynamic of Vegapunk and Saint Saturn more one of objectivity versus bias. Vegapunk has no preconceived notions of anything. Any thought that he has in his colossal apple brain has to undergo rigorous experimentation and confirmation before he'll accept it. Whereas Saturn is using science for the purpose of lies. It is his mission to obscure the quest for truth, not very science of him. Science itself is morally neutral. It can do great good and it can do great harm. And the discussion of how much of each of those can be attributed to the individual scientist is quite nuanced, but I don't think that's the discussion that Oda was trying to have. The battle between Dr. Vegapunk and Saint Saturn was one of truth, and in that regard they do actually have something in common. Something that makes Mr. Saint Saturn something of a hypocrite, as you may remember when he said, "Why is it that human beings feel the need to do what they are explicitly forbidden from doing?" That is a fantastic question, and one that he very much should have been able to answer himself, because the one big thing that Vegapunk and Saint Saturn have in common is an interest in the forbidden, and they even share a common research project. 200 years ago, Saturn and his scientists were ordered to dispose of Emmet after he attacked Marijois, but Saturn sneakily kept Emmet out of a profound desire to research the forbidden and to use it for the good of the world government, I'm sure, yes. But that good intention resulted in profoundly negative ramifications for them, much like a lot of Vegapunk's research has. Saturn said, "Why is it that these stupid human beings feel the need to do the thing they're forbidden from doing?" And then he goes off and does the same thing. I imagine that he doesn't include himself in the definition of human. He probably sees his own interest in the forbidden as above that of a human. As a god, I can do the forbidden thing. You can't. Stop it. But I can. Although Oda also includes a panel of his very human scientists thanking Saturn for being allowed to keep Emmet, with their faces lighting up with pure joy at the opportunity to research this forbidden technology, which a couple of centuries later is the decision that eventually allowed Vegapunk to do the same. And in a weird way, that's pretty perfectly representative of what science is meant to be. Each new generation of scientists begin their quest for truth by standing on the shoulder of the giants who came before them. On that and that occasion alone, Saint Saturn displayed the qualities of a scientist, which is what ended up dooming him, showing us that his role in this world was never about science to begin with. And in addition to the general idea of truth, Egghead Island also plays with the idea of fact versus faith, stepping a bit into that area of traditional conflict between science and religion, but I think that calling it faith is more accurate. Vegapunk is a man of fierce fact science who during his journey learns to practice faith, and he trusts neither of those concepts blindly. His science must be rigorously proven and tested, and his faith must, at the very least, have a demonstrable hypothesis behind it. He's quite consistently shocked by the inbuilt abilities of human beings, whether that's the Seraphim displaying capabilities beyond his expectations, or the surprising actions of the shell of Bartholomew Kuma. Vegapunk doesn't have an answer to how a lot of the phenomena happening around him are happening, but he's seen enough to put a pretty hefty bet of faith in humanity as a whole. On the other hand, Saint Saturn has no faith in humanity. He believes it to be fragile and inferior, which is fascinating because these two scientists had another joint experiment to prove each other's views, and that experiment was Mr. Bartholomew Kuma. Saturn was supremely confident that he could strip Kuma's humanity away completely without even understanding or wanting to understand what humanity is, which is a question that Vegapunk still struggles with, but at least he is trying to answer it, and he even tried to quantify the concept of free will. Losing free will in this research project means losing all of the memories and human emotions you've gained to this point in your life. And Vegapunk was wrong about that, because even after losing all of that, Kuma is still able to practice free will. But what that means is that Vegapunk was right about humanity in general, as Kuma's shell did still retain enough humanity to punch Saint Saturn in the face to save Bonnie, meaning that Saturn's experiment was an abysmal failure. Saturn is a man who practices blind faith and fundamentally incurious science. None of what he does goes through a process of rigorous testing, and it's almost as if Saturn gets bored of an experiment as soon as he detects the slightest sign of failure, which must make his life very boring because everything he's ever done is a failure. The Sapphire Scales disease was a result of his failure to create an unknown desired outcome. His gutting of Kuma was a failure because he still retained his humanity. Saturn's decision to retain Emmet and weaponize him was the failure that ultimately got him killed by Emu, and the one experiment that was a success was imbuing Bonnie with her devil fruit. fruit. However, that success was turned into a failure when that directly led to the egghead incident. Meanwhile, Vegapunk's greatest failure was a perfectly cloned devil fruit coming out pink instead of blue, and he's taken that failure quite hard. But I would also say that the very existence of Saturn also stands very much in opposition to science, because so much of Saint Saturn is magic coded, and yeah, there's the fun Arthur C. Clarke quote that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, but mate, when there is a pentagram with a spider demon coming out of it, I don't care, we are calling it magic. There was also a very sneaky Kuma line foreshadowing Saturn in his flashback. I would make a deal with you to save Bonnie's life, even if you were the devil himself. And I think that's part of what makes Saturn such a bad science man. Vegapunk wasn't gifted with supernatural powers by a strange dark entity with big old mega milkers sitting on the empty throne, so Vegapunk had to fully investigate science to reach any of his desires. He had to be curious about everything to build anything, whereas Saturn was assumedly born into limitless resources as well as granted world-class power by Emu. And what can science do for a man like that? That's why all he ever does are these macabre experiments, to see if he can kill someone in a slightly different way than all of the other ways he can naturally already kill them. And to be as fair as I can to Saint Saturn, which isn't much, but it's probably very difficult to be curious when you already believe yourself to be a god. Because what god is gonna waste time dicking around with the periodic table when they can just snap their fingers and make almost anything happen? Which is another distinction I should make. Saturn has a god complex, all of the world nobles do, but acknowledging the existence of a god, as long as it's not yourself, doesn't necessarily stop science and faith from being a good marriage. In fact, many of the more advanced civilizations in One Piece strike this balance rather well, like the most medically advanced island in the world, the Torino Kingdom, still maintaining its traditional values, or the dial technology developed in the extremely pious Skypiea. Elbaf also has something to say about this with their advancements in scientifically conjuring rainbows to travel across, and the Great Kingdom itself, the most advanced civilization in recorded history, is implied to have worshipped the sun god, and that feels quite intentional on Oda's part. I think it makes a lot of sense that these older, more traditional nations do have that technological edge, because the older you are, the closer you were to the Void Century, a time after which technology has mostly regressed, or at the very least stagnated. Whenever we see a flashback that occurs a few hundred years in the past, such as Nolan's story, it's pretty frightening just how little things seem to have changed in terms of technology, because we step back 400 years to that time, and if you didn't tell me it was 400 years ago, it would seem like the modern day. And so Vegapunk is a man whose mind was said to be living 500 years in the future, but it's more like he was living 800 years in the past, and that the world has been frozen in place for that entire time. A state that has now only changed thanks to Dr. Vegapunk's truth dissemination and the death of the very obstructive bad science man, J. Garcia Saturn. After awakening Gear 5th and taking on the abilities of a cartoon sun man, it takes something pretty damn serious in this world to be worth Eiichiro Oda's time to draw standing up to Mr. Monkey D. Luffy. And I don't just mean physically seriously, I mean thematically seriously. And Marine Admiral Kizaru was perfect for this for many perfect reasons. One of which is the legacy of him being the primary reason why the Straw Hats were separated for 2 years, and we've covered a lot of that discussion in a different video on this channel. But if we're just looking at these two characters in isolation, then this is a battle of light versus dawn. We've got our sun god destined to bring about the dawn of the world being confronted by the very concept of light itself. In addition to that, this is also a mental battle of liberation versus enslavement. Luffy, a man who believes that anything is possible and is always pushing the boundaries of freedom, versus Kizaru, a man who, for all intents and purposes, has the physical ability to do exactly the same, but is resigned to his role in the world. A man whose will has been broken or perhaps never even existed, to the point where he states that even he, one of the most powerful characters in the world, is just another cog in the machine, which is a very interesting setup. Kizaru is a surprisingly humble man, and we don't tend to see a lot of that with One Piece antagonists. However, Kizaru is probably too humble and with an extreme deficit of self-esteem. He's almost like a classic pre-time skip antagonist in regards to his broken will and complete subservience to the world in its current incarnation, and having a man with his abilities being a key agent of the world world government is almost an insult to the concept of light and everything it's supposed to bring. It's like the world government has weaponized light to be used against those who it's intended for. And that's why Luffy here has to thematically set the record straight, because light is a theme that's been associated with Luffy ever since the very beginning of the series, and in fact even before that in the One Piece prototypes, which were called Romance Dawn. Luffy growing up, going on his adventure and becoming the Pirate King is the sunrise that this planet has been waiting for. And throughout this fight, Luffy does come out not conclusively, but pretty consistently on top, and there's even one moment in particular where Luffy uses a Dawn attack, a Dawn stab, to dispel all of Kizaru's light clones, which is a great instance of Dawn, the real deal light, overcoming all of these fake artificial representations of light. And I should say that Kizaru is also very well aware that he's a bit of a thematic fraud. Kizaru himself understands to some degree what the Gear 5th form represents. He was told about Nika by Kuma, and he even did the funky Nika dance in Kuma's flashback, and so Kizaru is much more well aware of what Luffy embodies than I think any opponent Luffy has gone up against to date. But even knowing that, unfortunately Kizaru is something of a life atheist in the One Piece world. The really sad thing about him is that he doesn't believe in anything. There's even a moment where Sanji stops Kizaru's light beam attack and says, "Love is stronger than light," to which Kizaru replies, "If that's true, then physics as we know it is dead," which is a fun line, haha, but it shows that Kizaru believes in a world of rigid rules, and that there isn't an abstract concept he's looking towards that can break those rules, which is something that not even the world's foremost authority on science adheres to. Dr. Vegapunk is very much open to the mysterious, and he consistently pushes the bounds of reality to create the impossible, which is important to point out because Vegapunk is Kizaru's best friend, and yet they have such completely opposite mindsets. Luffy here is the unstoppable force, and Kizaru is the immovable mass. Luffy refuses to accept anything the way it currently is if it impedes his freedom, and Kizaru refuses to accept that anything can ever change even if it improves or grants him freedom. Another way that Oda highlights this with Kizaru is that he has a set of attacks based on the imperial regalia of Japan, 3 treasures that were brought to Earth by the ancestors of the imperial line, these being the Yatta no Kagami, the Asukani no Magatama, and the Kusanagi no Tsurugi, all of which Kizaru has attacks based on, and he even has a move called Amaterasu, which is named after the sun goddess, the chief deity of the Shinto pantheon. So as a non-Japanese speaker, this concept may not come across quite as powerfully, but Kizaru embodies this very traditional old world order. There's a lot of history incorporated into Kizaru, lots. So much so that there doesn't seem to be any room left within him to consider the future. And he's fighting against Luffy, who yes, also has a lot of history attached to him, but he doesn't know it, and he rarely thinks about the past at all. With Luffy, it's all about living in the moment and continuing to move forward. It's a very evenly matched bout in that regard, the power of all history versus the infinite potential of the future. But it's also not a straightforward fight to judge in terms of an outcome. No, not at all. Generally in One Piece, when Luffy fights an antagonist, his goal is to beat them by punching them lots until they don't get up again. However, Luffy's goal was never to beat Kizaru on Egghead Island, just to stall him in order to allow Vegapunk to escape. And likewise, Kizaru's goal was never to beat Luffy, it was to slip past him and kill Vegapunk. So this isn't really a test of strength. Luffy wins this fight if Vegapunk escapes, and Kizaru wins the fight if Vegapunk dies. Although the definition of win that I'm using for Kizaru here is very liberal. Personally, I think that in Kizaru's position there was no option to win, or at least no option that he was willing to pursue. But even if Kizaru can't win, Luffy can definitely still lose, especially because Kizaru can also do a lot more than just physical damage. In addition to killing Dr. Vegapunk, Kizaru was also charged with destroying dreams. And the main moment of illustration of this is a very underrated moment during the fight where Kizaru kicks Luffy into the Vega Force 1, destroying it. And I definitely don't think that this moment lands as hard as it should, but Kizaru did this on purpose to destroy the robot because doing so would destroy Vegapunk's dream. This robot was built using Emmet as a guide, at least the parts that were possible to recreate, and Vegapunk refers to the Vega Force 1 as the quote dream of mankind. Exactly why it's the dream of mankind isn't really explored beyond the Emmet connection, and I suppose it could represent a modern day step towards achieving the dream technology of the past. But in the color spread of chapter 1101, Eiichiro Oda drew all of the Vegapunks, and amongst them he made sure to include the Vega Force 1. It is such an important creation to Vegapunk that it was even included here like a 7th satellite, as if it represented the aspect of hope, or dreams, just straightforward dreams, and Kizaru made sure to eliminate that hope and dream as quickly as he could. And he knows that he's been a very bad boy here, because Kizaru even gloats explodes by saying, "I've blown your so-called giant robot of dreams to smithereens." So the dude is a certified dream destroyer. He's a menace. But luckily, Luffy just so happens to be a licensed dream builder. As immediately after Kizaru gloats, giant Luffy appears and grabs Kizaru, which is a very purposeful juxtaposition by Oda. Kizaru gloating over destroying one dream giant, only for a real dream giant to step in to take its place and inherit that hope for the world. In the end, Luffy quite clearly wins the Battle of Dreams, because sure, Kizaru does kill Vegapunk, but in doing so, it unleashes his legacy onto the world, and it amplifies that dream beyond anything that Vegapunk could have hoped for in life. Meanwhile, there's also a second dream that Kizaru actively threatens, which is that of Bartholomew Kuma, by endangering and even attempting to kill Jewelry Bonnie. However, this is also a dream battle that Luffy wins, not only by managing to protect her, but also inspiring her to take on the Nika form herself. But in talking about Nika, we also need to discuss the liberation front of this fight. Despite his incredible power, Kizaru is one of the most trapped characters in the entire series, and he has very little to no willpower of his own to do anything about it, which is most evident in the fact that he's one of the very few top fighters on this planet who does not possess Conqueror's Haki, which is the ability to assert your willpower over others. According to the One Piece power system, Kizaru can only have the will of others asserted over him. Now, to be fair, it still needs to be a pretty damn powerful will, but if that will exists, then Kizaru has no defense against it. And throughout his time in the series, Kizaru has also shown an extreme external locus of control. His language very much focuses on what's happening around him and how those events force him to respond. He often says stuff like, "Well, this really puts me in a bind now," or some variation of that. Essentially, there's a complete lack of, not personal responsibility, it's actually a lot worse than that. It's a complete lack of any personal agency. It's like Kizaru is a stationary existence as the world moves around him. Again, the exact opposite of Luffy, who never stops moving, even to the point where he moves the world around himself. And one of the most amazing moments during the fight is when Luffy reinforces this dynamic of willpower. He becomes a giant and says to Saint Saturn and Kizaru that you guys aren't going anywhere. This is Luffy exercising his own personal freedom whilst restricting Kizaru's. That is a physical representation of how both Luffy and Kizaru see themselves. Kizaru in this panel is such a small, powerless individual whose terms of existence are dictated to him. And then you've got Luffy, who's this larger-than-life character who won't accept anyone telling him what to do. Even if it's a Marine Admiral or one of the 5 Elder Stars, doesn't matter. I'll just become bigger and stronger and freer. And Kizaru is also quite impressed by Luffy's willpower. Early on in the fight, he states, "I can see why you're the man who defeated Kaido." And what's important about this is that this happens before Luffy even uses Gear 5th. He's still on Gear 4th at this point, so Kizaru's not necessarily referring to physical strength because he's not showing anything special at the moment. Instead, Kizaru says very powerful stuff in recognition of Luffy's drive and the acknowledgement of evolution that Luffy has gone through since the last time they met. I imagine that most people who run into Kizaru and promptly lose to him aren't all that keen to fight him again. So it really says something that it was Luffy who chose to engage and start the fight. And in Kizaru, there was definitely the potential for a Katakuri situation to play out, where Katakuri was mentally liberated from the binds of perfection and feeling trapped under the immense weight of Big Mom by Luffy. And Kizaru had that opportunity as well, but he made a very different choice. During Kuma's flashback, there's a very interesting discussion surrounding what it means to lose free will. Kuma was pondering about what his life was going to be like after the completion of the process, and Vegapunk's explanation is as follows. Losing free will in this research project means losing all of the memories and human emotions you've gained to this point in your life, which I find fascinating, because Eiichiro Oda very clearly had this in mind while he was writing all of the major Egghead characters, Kizaru included. And throughout the arc, Kizaru loses neither his memories nor his emotions. And in fact, during every step of the way, he is reminiscing and regretting. He's always saying, "Oh, this is so difficult for me. Oh, let's not drag this out." And the first thing he does when he encounters Bonnie is bring up the past, and Kizaru is also the one who gives us the Sentomaru flashback, but Kizaru even smiles and thinks back to how adorable Sentomaru was back then. The dude cannot stop remembering and emoting. And this even extends to the Straw Hats as well when Kizaru reaches the Flabberface, he says, the Straw Hat crew, we had some times together. So according to Vegapunk's definition, Kizaru does indeed have free will. Not only that, he has a lot of free will. During this arc, he's one of the characters who demonstrates most Vegapunk's definition of free will, meaning that Kizaru is actively choosing the path he's going down, even if it doesn't necessarily feel that way to him. And also in the free will discussion, Vegapunk added, however you might be following your orders from above at the moment, would you continue to do their bidding if they told you to kill a child? And for Kizaru, the answer to that question is yes, mate, let's do it. If he was ordered to kill a child, he would 100% go for it. And we know this because we saw him flat out go for the kill with Jewelry Bonnie. He tried to slice her in half. This is not very nice. And that puts a very different spin on the Kizaru character. He's a man lying to himself. If you believe his words, and he has no real choice in what he's doing, but that's not true. He has every bit as much free will as everyone else on this island. And quite frankly, it's a bit embarrassing to claim to be trapped when a cyborg Kuma shows up and exercises free will to save Bonnie without having any memories, any emotions, or having any recognizable humanity left in him. Kizaru is trying to tell himself that he has less free will than a mindless, emotionless robot slave. But look, if Kuma can do it, then Kizaru can do it. However, Kizaru doesn't do it. And that brings us to Floor Piece. One of my ongoing jokes while Egghead was being published was just how much time Kizaru was spending on that there floor. And we know that it's not because he was incapable of moving, it's because he refused to move. Because moving would require making a decision, and making a decision would be admitting that you've got the free will to make said decision. So for the most part, Kizaru just freezes. He's not like Luffy, who was brought down by exhaustion and started moving again the very second he could. And the reason why we know that Kizaru was faking his immobility to some degree is because in the SBS of Volume 110, Oda revealed that it was Kizaru who brought the food to Luffy so that he could eat and recover. In chapter 1103, he, Luffy, suddenly starts eating. Who on earth responded to Luffy's pleas for meat? Was it Sanji or Frankie who were nearby? Kizaru and Sentomaru were there too. It seems like nobody found out. In other words, their actions went unnoticed, like it was done at the speed of light. I don't know either. Speed of light. So this is Oda very playfully telling us that Kizaru was the one who did it, because he's the only one who was fast enough to get it done without being noticed. And the lack of clarity here is also intentional, because Kizaru's motto is of course unclear justice. So Oda's giving us this answer in a very unclear way, as is representative Kizaru. This is the most free will that Kizaru has ever displayed, and we didn't even see it in the actual manga. But in this moment, he made a meek choice to support liberation. A very confusing and of course unclear choice. Originally, I thought that this may have been because he resigned himself to his fate, but at the very least he wanted to try and save Bonnie and Sentomaru. But shortly after that, he genuinely tries to kill Bonnie anyway, so I don't know. It's unclear as to what Kizaru was thinking here and why he chose this of all moments as the time to exercise an uncharacteristic display of free will. But this right here is what I mean by that Katakuri potential. There was a glimmer of hope there, a very clear potential turning point for Kizaru. But instead, he chose to keep going straight, just like light. Light can't change direction unless something knocks it in another direction. Kizaru was thematically locked in, and he just went back to what he was doing. And he does successfully complete his mission and kill Dr. Vegapunk as ordered. And after this, Kizaru stops making choices for the rest of the arc. He just lays completely motionless on a marine battleship and completely resigns what little free will he had remaining, allowing one of the most monumental events in world history to play out around him with no personal input. And so when the story of Egghead Island gets retold and passed down through the generations, Kizaru's role here will be incredibly minimized and eventually forgotten altogether. So Vegapunk died, however, the true outcome of this fight still has yet to be made clear. It's all very unclear. Initially, it did seem like Kizaru claimed what passes for victory here, as he did kill Vegapunk. However, by the end of Egghead Island, we do discover that all of his satellites did survive in their own way, even York. So everything that Vegapunk was does still exist in this world, just divided into a few different bits. But on top of that, though, on Elbaf it was revealed that the Straw Hats managed to escape with a, quote, perfect recreation of Vegapunk, something that isn't like the satellites. This is a perfect clone, which Lilith plans to bring to life. So is Vegapunk dead? I have no idea, because his brain is still functioning as Punk Records. He also has 6 parts of himself roaming the world, and a full-on clone about to be up and running. But is he alive? I don't know about that either. These kind of questions are very difficult to answer, which is why the outcome of Luffy versus Kizaru is at best unclear. However, the conclusion I would offer is that yes, Kizaru won the physical contest by killing Vegapunk, or his body at the very least. However, Luffy, being the very good son boy he is, managed to preserve Vegapunk's dream as well as his memory, and as the old saying goes, when does a man die? When he is forgotten. And even if the Vegapunk we know is truly gone, he certainly will not be forgotten for thousands of years, which is why the power of Dawn won, as Luffy not only managed to preserve Vegapunk's dream, but also his life for millennia to come. The One Piece anime is finally back. It's just taken a 6-month hiatus, which is the only hiatus that One Piece has ever had since the beginning of its run in 1999, which I guess technically means that season 1 of One Piece lasted 1,122 episodes, and we have now officially just begun season 2 with episode 1,123, but also 1,124, because we got 2 episodes, one Saturday, one Sunday, back to back to celebrate the return of One Piece, and let me tell you, it was a phenomenal weekend of fictional pirates. But the big question that we now have to answer is, has the anime actually done it? Did this break accomplish everything we needed it to? And how does the future of the One Piece anime look going forward? Firstly, I should say if you're an anime-only watcher, this video is probably going to contain some spoilers, because it's quite difficult to analyze exactly what's going on without them, especially with the openings and endings, which contain some really tragically beautiful imagery of events that have yet to be inflicted upon you. But they will be. Oh, they will be. And on that note, the new opening is brilliant. The song is called Angel and Devil by Green Boys, which could not be more appropriate for the themes that this part of the Egghead arc is tackling, as we've got an almost literal angel and devil dynamic happening between Bartholomew Kuma and St. J. Garcia Saturn, so this song fits unbelievably well with the story that it is charged with supporting. It's a really interesting song because it's quite bittersweet. Parts of it are absolutely packed with high energy, and then other bits of it go really somber and reflective. It almost feels like a funeral song, you know, a tragic event designed to celebrate life, which fits very well with the visuals, because there's a lot of hints at all of the horrors of Bonnie and Kuma's backstories, but what's primarily shown is a celebration of their relationship. The opening is also quite unique in that it's the first One Piece opening I've seen that makes Luffy feel like a bit of a side character. If I knew nothing about One Piece and I watched this opening, I would think that Jewelry Bonnie was the main character. And fair enough, because she kind of will be for a while, and she does end this arc taking on Luffy's Gear 5th form, so almost literally taking over the role of protagonist. But if I did know some things about One Piece, not everything, but some things, and if I watched this opening, I'd be thinking that Bonnie is a guaranteed Straw Hat, because she starts and finishes the opening aboard the Thousand Sunny with the rest of the crew around her. She definitely feels like a Straw Hat at least. But also, if you listen to the full track, which is available on the Green Boys YouTube channel, then this song ends beautifully with the lead singer softly saying "we are," which is a nice little touch there that didn't make it into the actual opening. But seeing this does make me wish that One Piece would have done this sort of thing a bit more over the years. There was definitely an era where One Piece openings got quite repetitive because they always hit the same beats. Straw Hats relax on ships, Straw Hats islands. Oh no, Marines are here, generic action, and then some Arcturian stuff. But you know what? It would have been really cool to have, say, a Trafalgar Law dedicated opening during Dressrosa or something like that. Although this does lead to one complaint that I have seen with opening 27, and it's the same complaint that always happens. A fair few people aren't happy with the amount of spoilers in this opening, because you do see quite a lot, hence why I had to use the spoiler warning at the beginning of this video. And I used to be one of those people who really picked apart and got very at anime openings because of how much they dared to reveal. But over my many years of watching fictional pirates in this world, what I've come to realize is that the vast majority of anime watchers won't even notice a fraction of the spoilers that manga readers get upset about. Everything seems so obvious, ever so obvious to us, but that's only because we have the context of what's going on. And I think that the only time the One Piece anime has made a truly horrendous move was by showing Robin as part of the crew during the opening of the Alabasta arc, well before she actually joined the crew. Otherwise, spoilers in One Piece openings aren't really as big of a deal as manga readers make them out to be. But I have to say my favorite part of this opening is the opening of the opening, which is very underrated in my opinion. It starts with the hands of baby Bonnie reaching up to the sun, then her hands reaching out to a closed window post Sapphire Scales, then we see her hands reaching out on Sabari, then there's a flame transition, which I think is when Bonnie was captured by Blackbeard, and finally her hands are caught in the warm eddy where the Straw Hats find her. And bang, the intro music really kicks in. Oh, it is so good and so effective, somehow managing to summarize Bonnie's entire life to this point in about 10 seconds. Although my favorite part is right at the start of the chorus, where Bonnie sees Luffy in Nika form, and then we cut to Bonnie and Kuma doing the Nika dance at the most powerful and most hopeful part of the entire song. It's another brilliant opening. One Piece openings have been on absolute fire ever since opening 25, The Peak, which was directed by Megumi Ishitani, who also did opening 26. However, this opening 27, was directed by Wataru Matsumi, who you may remember was the man who did the Shanks vs. Eustace Kid episode, one of the most memorable pieces of animation contributed that year. And not only that, but Wataru Matsumi is now the overall series director of One Piece, taking over from Tatsuya Nakamine, who was series director starting from Wano and really led the One Piece anime revolution that breathed some very desperate fresh air into an extremely stagnant Toei production. You may never have even heard his name before, but he is one of the people directly responsible for saving the One Piece anime in my opinion. And to be clear, a series director is different from an episode director. A series director is more like what we call a showrunner, although they do still direct their own episodes as well. And episode 1123 passes this torch pretty damn well. The opening scene is a sunrise across the entire planet. We see shots of many familiar locations as a new day arrives, bringing many new promises. And in addition to everything happening within the One Piece world, this is visual language telling us that this is a new start for the One Piece anime. In particular, it's very nice to see that the anime is continuing to invest into atmospheric lighting, especially when it comes to anything involving the sun. The One Piece anime prior to Wano had traditionally been lit extremely flatly, which worked well enough for the early days, maybe not so much for the middle days. But after Luffy's Sun God revelation, I've noticed that the anime has been taking light a lot more seriously because it is a visual metaphor for Luffy's effect on the world around him. So lately, the anime has been really great at using light as a metaphor for the status of many major characters, like how Saint Saturn is in his dank dark room, like a shriveled old demon hiding from the light, and the rest of the elders in the Room of Authority are given very stark side lighting, which makes half of their faces super bright and the other half super dark, which is all about portraying this dichotomy of angel and devil. The elders are, in name, paramount saints of this planet. They're as holy as you can come, but in reality, they are very much devils, dirty, filthy devils. One of them's even a worm. They live in dirt. But I love that you can see this dynamic through lighting alone. It's just a couple of simple choices sprinkled in here and there to really elevate the atmosphere of these scenes. But something we absolutely need to address is pacing, which has always been my major concern. And as much as I enjoyed both of these new episodes, it does seem that they are sticking to the established pacing of one chapter per episode, which is a choice that, to be fair, I think worked very well for these two episodes, primarily because there was a lot of justified recap. Because you've got anime watchers coming back to One Piece after 6 months, so yeah, I do think they need to be reacquainted with the world and the specific events happening on Egghead Island, because it's not a simple scenario. So episode 1123 does a lot of that straightforward recap, whereas episode 1124 does a lot of gap filling that the manga didn't do. It reminds us of York's betrayal and very straightforwardly states and shows just how the Straw Hats got out of that bad situation. In the manga, we just cut away from it and never go back to it. But I think this is fair enough because those gaps do need some fillings, especially if you've just taken a big break. If you're an anime watcher and you've just come back after 6 months, you're probably going to be a little bit confused as crap as to exactly what happened due to a time skip that you may or may not have forgotten about, and it's helpful to linger in those events a bit to refamiliarize yourself with everyone and everything. So I have no problem with the pacing of these first 2 episodes. I think they worked quite well. However, I do worry for almost every episode to follow, especially the more action-based ones, which is most of Egghead Island from this point on, Kuma flashback excluded. So what I was really hoping for was for the anime to use this as an opportunity to be adapting something more like 2 chapters per episode, because sure, 1 chapter might work in those very dialogue-heavy chapters, but where the anime traditionally struggles a lot is in chapters that are all action, which is going to be next week's episode, by the way, covering chapter 1091. That chapter is almost 100% all action with a short Sentomaru flashback, so we'll see how that works out. better, but I can't help but worry that we're just setting ourselves up to have the exact same problems. That we've gone and taken this huge break, that we've gone and made this big statement about the new era of the One Piece anime, just for it to fall back into all of those same problems. And I think the soundtrack of these first 2 episodes is also quite emblematic of this as well, especially episode 1124. One part that kind of irked me was where Vegapunk mentions Elbaf, and then Luffy and Usopp react, which is accompanied by this very peppy tropical track. I've forgotten its name. It's the one that goes, it's a fun song, but it's the same fun song that the One Piece anime has been using for almost 30 years now. To me, a lot of the One Piece music library feels very old and very tired. And ideally, I feel that every new island, every new arc should come with its own unique soundtrack to match the atmosphere of that island, instead of always falling back on the same stuff we've had since East Blue. Or at the very least, put an island-specific remix on the old songs. Give me the peppy party track with a digital futuristic twist or something. I don't know, something. And then when we get to Elbaf, I don't know, maybe rearrange everything with an emphasis on old instruments and grand orchestrals. I don't know, again, just something to keep One Piece fresh, because I think the music is really letting it down. Because as much as I can see so much effort going into art, going into animation, going into direction, it feels like when it comes to the score, they've got an intern spending maybe 10 minutes inserting the same old tracks from the sound library. So one of the songs used in episode 1123, around the 10-minute mark, is called Gasparde's Power, and it was made for Gasparde, the villain of One Piece Movie 4, Dead End Adventure, which came out in 2003, and they've been milking this song for 22 years. It gets used in so many episodes, too many episodes, and in fact, a colossal amount of music in the episodes comes directly from the movies, because when it comes to the movies, they actually had a budget to hire a composer, and so everything that gets made for the movies then gets relentlessly recycled into the anime. But another thing that we should really address is Frankie's new voice. At the end of last year, it was announced that Frankie's voice actor Kazuki Yao would be retiring, which wasn't a huge surprise to anyone who's been watching the anime. Frankie's voice has been on a very steady decline over the past many years, and so on the Jump Festa stage, Frankie's role was ceremonially passed on to Subaru Kimura, and his debut of Frankie was in this episode. And I have to say, yeah, it was obviously really jarring, and I think what really doesn't help is that in that first episode, we only heard one line from Frankie, which was him asking if Robin's injuries were okay. And it's not a bad voice by any means. I actually think the depth of the voice suits a character of Frankie's size quite well. Like, that is the kind of voice that I would expect to see out of something like him. And I definitely don't think that the mission should have been to try and replicate the original voice. It's just that what Kazuki Yao brought to Frankie and all of his characters was so unique, and so anything else is gonna be jarring. And this was definitely not an amazing debut episode because, again, Frankie only had one line. But to be honest, it's not gonna get a lot better than that for the rest of the Egghead arc. As is post-time skip tradition, Frankie is very much a background feature, so he's going to pop up here and there, and I think his lines are going to feel very jarring for the foreseeable future. Think about it like listening to Shakespeare. At first, it's very hard to keep up because the language being used is so unnatural compared to the English we speak today, but about 10 minutes into a show, you become acclimatized to it. It becomes natural. But that only works if you have that 10 straight minutes of the language bombarding you. And unfortunately, there's no point during Egghead Island where Frankie gets a really solid speech or enough dialogue in general to acclimatize us to the new voice, which I think is a real shame. The new actor absolutely deserves the opportunity to make his mark, but there's not a lot of material for him to work with. We did get a lot more of his performance in the subsequent episode, 1124, and after that, I am a bit more settled in, like marginally. I actually think that Frankie was even given a couple of extra lines that weren't in the manga to help him bridge that gap a bit more, and that may also be why Frankie does seem to have a bit of an increased role on Elbaf so far. I mean, I say increased relatively to usual, because this whole situation must have gotten Oda thinking about how he uses Frankie, which isn't at all uncommon. Voice actors often inspire Oda to make canon manga decisions, the most famous example being that he gradually made Chopper a lot cuter after hearing Ikue Otani's performance and deciding that his original design for Chopper would not do her performance justice. But look, the real test for Frankie is going to be when he does his first super line. I think that's where a lot of people are going to make their solid judgment. Overall, I do like the new voice quite a lot. If Frankie was a new character popping up just now with this voice, I would be 100% on board with it. It's just gonna take a very, very long time to deprogram decades of listening to and expecting Kazuki Ao's performance. Although one thing I will say is that this new Frankie does have a very strong sense of, I guess, youth within him, because Subaru Kimura is only 34 years old, so he's a baby compared to the rest of the crew. And I don't know if this is just me being hyper aware of the voice actors, but the other Straw Hats are starting to sound a bit old to me now that we have someone on the crew who's under 50 years old to compare them to. Again, that could just be me. And so moving on, the new ending is also very much worth mentioning. Unlike the opening, this is 100% pure Bonnie focused, and it's quite adorable. I absolutely love all of the little neon drawings of Bonnie and Kuma, with the neon effects doing quite well with the Beatsome song. And there's some very tragic symbolism if you look closely. In particular, there's this flashing shot of a spider having caught and consuming a blue butterfly. The spider clearly representing Saint Saturn, and I suppose that the butterfly could be either Jinny or Bonnie. Jinny having been caught and infected with sapphire scales devoured, or Bonnie inheriting the sapphire scales and being trapped her entire life in this web cast by Saturn and desperate to escape. And there's also a type of shot in this ending that we don't think ever see in One Piece. We cut to a very broad and infinite landscape. And this is the kind of standard anime shot that you would see in a lot of isekai or other adventure series, but it is very odd for this much mundane land to be shown in One Piece, which generally focuses its landscape shots on water or the weird island-specific stuff that we go to. It's almost like seeing a glimpse of what the world used to look like before the flood of the Void Century happened. But it's likely much more basic than that. It's a very barren and oppressive landscape that doesn't look like it can support much life, if any life, which I suppose represents how Bonnie is feeling right now. However, by the end of the ending, Bonnie is standing in this inviting, lush green expanse, which definitely can support life, and symbolizing that she can now live again, which is the feeling that Bonnie achieves at the climax of Egghead Island. And the fact that the land is so wide and looks essentially infinite is to give us the feeling of maximum freedom. Although one thing that really breaks me in this ending is Vegapunk slamming his fist against the screen projecting Kuma vanishing, which actually seems to take place within a human body. There is a big old skeleton here that housed the last remnants of Kuma that just vanished. So it's like watching that last tiny piece of Kuma's humanity evaporating from within him. All in a very abstract way, which doesn't give straight up spoilers, which I like. The focus is on the feeling rather than the literal event. And really, this is a pretty perfect anime ending. I like it a lot. It may be one of the best that One Piece has ever had. All of which is why, pacing concerns aside, I am very, very optimistic about this new era of the One Piece anime. Because Toei recently have been consistently showing us that they want to make One Piece better. And not just better, they want it to reach the heights worthy of having the greatest source material in the history of media to work with. So I'm beyond thrilled to see that effort, and for the first time in a very long time, I look forward to watching One Piece each and every week. The Toei anime made some very interesting changes to the God Valley incident as we know it, in addition to the entire Kuma flashback, and it's gotten to the point where it's no longer enough to just watch the anime or just read the manga, as both are conveying important information seemingly exclusive to their respective mediums. Ever since the return of the One Piece anime, I've been paying a lot more attention to it than usual, because we have a new series director for the first time since Wano began, and pretty significant changes are being made. Some for the better, others for worse, and some that are so impactful that it even recontextualizes the manga. And I have to say that episode 1129 is a bit of a masterclass in how anime changes can very much enhance the manga. In particular, there's this beautiful moment of Bonnie remembering Kuma while she's being held by Saturn, which is this lovely drawn pastel sequence of Bonnie and Kuma doing the Nika dance, which is a phenomenal artistic choice to show us an event from the perspective of Jewelry Bonnie, who is a child. It's like asking a young child in school to draw a picture of their family with crayons and stuff. Something that makes the parent feel all warm and proud and want to stick to the fridge. And I think that the One Piece anime really excels when it takes stylistic risks like this, because this is something that the manga cannot do. Oda can't just break out the pastels and charcoal and start drawing in a completely new medium. And the best part about this sequence is right at the end. There's a close-up of Kuma's face, and it is by far the most detailed of all the drawings, which is the artistic way of showing us just how important Kuma is to Bonnie. Everything else in her memory is a vague shape, but what really stands out and what is really seared into Bonnie's memory is the loving smile of her father. I should say this flashback does also happen in the manga, but it's drawn in the standard Oda style and it just doesn't pack the same emotional oomph as the anime does. And this episode also did a lot of extra justice to the Kuma flashback by adding more time with his parents, particularly his father Clap. And the anime takes the time to make it clear that Clap is a priest who lives in the Sorbet Kingdom Church. We didn't find that out until much later in the manga, and I know this doesn't seem like a big deal, but it is. The order in which you find out information can change your impression of that information. Also in the anime, we even see Clap wearing his priest robes, and this is a smack right in the flashback nutsack because Clap's priest guard is what Kuma's modern day outfit is based on. He's dressing like his father, and in fact Kuma's clerical wear may even be his father's clothes, just altered with the target and the paw pattern. And I think it is such a shame that we don't see this in the manga because it just gives me a completely different impression of Kuma. Not completely different, but it adds so much to him. Specifically because he only started wearing this outfit after he found Bonnie. So when Kuma became a father, he decided to take on that role by dressing like his father. And it's just the tiniest shot of sweetness, but it's absolute genius from whichever Toei staff member it is who wanted to include it. In addition to that, the anime also makes it very clear that Kuma was born in the chapel, whereas in the manga, it's kind of a vague space. All we had was a blank white background. But I want it noted that in the anime, Kuma was born and held by his parents for the first time in the exact same spot that Kuma would later find and hold Bonnie for the first time. So Kuma became a father in the same spot where his father became a father. And these are all beautiful ideas that I'm sure did exist in the mind brain of Eiichiro Oda, but the speed in which he needs to draw the manga means that a lot of these little pieces of connective tissue just go missing in the process. And that's where the anime can often be very, very useful in slowing things down and picking up these little connections. But for something a lot less beautiful, the Toei anime also extends Kuma's time as a slave in the Holy Land. We see a lot more of his joyous childhood, and in exchange, we also get hit with a lot more of his horrific physical and emotional pain. In particular, there is a scene added that I think anime-only watchers would be aghast wasn't in the manga, which is the part where Kuma's mother is taken away. In the manga, Kuma's mother is just suddenly gone. We cut from her holding Kuma in chains, then to some other horrible things that are happening, and suddenly we've got Clap announcing that his wife is dead. And what's nice, or well, not nice, but what's so hard-hitting about this is it gives you an idea of just how meaningless their lives are to the world nobles. That the person you love most in this world can exist in one panel and then be completely erased by the next. However, in the anime, we do see a filler scene of Kuma's mother's parting words where she says, "Kuma, live your life no matter how hard it gets." And I do really like that we get to see his mother's influence in the anime. She is admittedly a bit of a non-entity in the manga. In fact, she only says a single word, which is Kuma, and only appears for a total of 3 panels. Part of that is again to demonstrate the fleeting and disposable approach to life that the world nobles have, but part of it is also the fact that Eiichiro Oda he doesn't have enough space to draw everything that he wants to. And so I do appreciate that the anime gave Kuma's mother that impact on her son, because no doubt those words have powered Kuma throughout his entire tragic life. But in a bit more of a weird maneuver, this episode gave us young Figgle and Garling's color scheme, and for all of the great work that the anime is doing, this is a bit of a disaster. The blonde banana hair, that's one thing, that's fine, and it's given us a lot of fun Garling banana memes, but whoever chose these colors needs to be thoroughly disciplined for picking chartreuse. Chartreuse is a word that wankers use to describe the meeting point between green and yellow, and it can look quite nice depending on how much of each you put into it, but it can also come out looking like an infant's diarrhea. That is what Garling's breast-only covering jacket looks like, as if baby Shanks had an accident all over it before the native hunting competition began. And it really is like the art team had a bet to see who could come up with the worst color scheme. But this is now our long-awaited window into the God Valley incident. And in episode 1130, there was an opening flashback where we see an extra scene of Kuma chasing a bird with his parents, and then we replay the events of Kuma's life, but from his perspective. This is a very interesting shot, and it is a complete Kuma POV. So this is a case where technically, yes, this is filler, but it's done quite cleverly and artistically enough that it gives us a different insight into the same events we've already seen. And there's something especially painful about being forced to step into Kuma's shoes here, where seeing events happen to him elicits sympathy, but experiencing those events with him taps more into empathy. Kuma's parents, even after their death, actually continue to linger and play a much larger role in the anime than they did in the manga. Such as when making the decision to be a decoy, there is a brief flashback to Kuma's parents, and when Ivankov calls Kuma's paws the hands of liberation, Kuma also had a flashback to his father's words. And at the end of episode 1130, something I really like is the stylistic choice to mirror all of Jinny and Kuma's scenes together on the Sorbet Kingdom, with flashbacks of Kuma doing the same thing with his parents. Eating, chopping wood, etc. Really hammering home that Kuma has found a new family with Jinny. And this was very deliberately done to make it feel even worse when Jinny eventually gets captured by the world nobles. To make it very, very clear that with Jinny, Kuma has reclaimed everything he lost because of the world nobles, only for Kuma to go on and lose his family a second time. And I do think that it's more effective than the way the manga did it. It's just that extra stab in the heart to raise the audience that much higher before dropping them into the pit of abyss. But we do also need to talk about the Rox pirates, and one thing that I found quite unfortunate about the anime adaptation is that in the manga there is this fantastic Rox pirates group shot, the biggest group shot we've seen to date, which the anime didn't quite live up to, and part of that is because it omitted 5 members of the Rox pirates. Probably most importantly, the anime doesn't show Stroyson, who you can see here in the very bottom right of the panel. He is the sociopathic little cookman who found Charlotte Lin and started the Big Mom Pirates with her. And this panel here was confirmation that he was also a member of the Rox Pirates, so it was definitely a shame not to see him there in the anime. And in addition, there's also 4 currently unknown Rox Pirates members who were not animated. To be fair, these guys are probably just Rox Pirates set dressing in the manga from Oda, kind of like what he did with the Roger Pirates, where there's about 20 extra crew members who all have names and unique designs, but we know nothing about them and probably never will. Still, it would have been nice to see them in the anime, because that panel in the manga really gives you a sense of, whoa, this is a large force of infamous pirates. Whereas in the anime, it feels more like a skeleton crew. But also, due to the business model of the anime, it has to move slower than the manga at all times. And because of that, the anime does tend to excel when it gets to flesh out these small manga details, rather than completely remove them. And there is also a 6th Rox Pirates member that you may or may not have noticed in the anime. It's the very well-rounded head dude right here. He's quite clear in the manga, but in the anime, he's hidden behind Whitebeard and colored quite darkly so that you wouldn't even notice him if you weren't looking for him. And this episode in particular was pretty highly anticipated, at least by me, because this was the debut of the voice of Rox D. Zebek. Here we get 2 whole spoken lines from Mr. Rox, and I have to say, it was slightly underwhelming. To be fair to the voice actor Shinsu Fuji, he didn't really get much to work with. Rox at this stage is still being kept completely shrouded in mystery. I don't even know how an actor would go about performing a character that he knows nothing about, but he kind of sounded like a generic old man. And I actually personally mistook Rox's first line for Whitebeard speaking at first. He's definitely lacking that commanding presence of a man who subdued Whitebeard, Big Mom, and Kaido. And his next opportunity to leave an impression of us won't be for a while. We'll be waiting till Elbaf to hear from Rox again, where he does get a bit more to say, but that'll probably be in a year and a half or maybe even 2 years from now. However, something I found very intriguing about the anime has to do with the God Valley chest prizes. In the anime, Emporio Ivankov and Bartholomew Kuma, greedy little pricks they are, steal all 6 prize chests instead of just the ones with Kaido's fruit and the pawpaw fruit. Now the manga blasts through all of this very, very quickly. We just see Kuma and Ivankov holding the devil fruits. I don't even see the chests, but this chest business is potentially relevant because it is suspected that one of these 6 chests is where baby Shanks ended up in, which then made its way to Roger's ship. And also not to be forgotten, the other 4 chests that they took also contain very special prizes. We don't know what those prizes were at the time of this recording, but it's very possible that they were also 4 other extremely powerful and influential devil fruits that we have seen in the series. And look, as far as the God Valley incident in the anime goes, it was actually extremely lean. In fact, there was very little filler whatsoever. Most of the filler was packed into Kuma related stuff before the incident happened, and as I've said, God Valley even cut some stuff from the manga. So it was, for the most part, pretty faithful to the manga portrayal of the event. And my guess as to why that is would be because Toei is a bit too timid to take too many liberties with God Valley, because if they go and add extra scenes with characters like Roger, Rox, Garp, and everyone else who was on the island, then it may end up contradicting future manga revelations by Oda. Because even though we had a whole episode, this was only the briefest of glimpses as to what actually happened on God Valley. With Kuma though, many liberties are taken, and if I were Kuma, I would start to feel personally attacked by Toei, because almost all of those liberties result in more pain for him. Such as in episode 1131, one of the most striking differences is that Kuma taking away the bubble pain of the elderly is significantly more brutal in the anime than in the manga. In the manga, most of what happened occurred off-page. Oda likes to leave that stuff to the imagination. But in the anime, we see this visceral and disturbing scene of the bubble very slowly shrinking as Kuma absorbs more and more of the pain. And there's also a point at the end where Kuma throws up the entire blood supply of a standard human body. It looks not great. When I say not great, I mean it's a great scene. It's horrifying. It looks not great. I don't want to do it. That's what I mean. But whether this changes for better or worse, I think you can make the argument either way. I do think there is something nice about keeping the horror locked in the imagination, but I also can't deny that seeing exactly what Kuma has to go through in excruciating slow detail makes me respect him a hell of a lot, because we now know exactly what he has to do every Sunday, and knowing that he is more than happy to undergo this pain for the sake of relieving others just makes me give him more thumbs up than I have thumbs. But next up, there's actually a very cute change that the anime made. While they're eating dinner together, there is a filler scene where Kuma asks if he and Jinny can do something tomorrow, and what they ultimately decide to do is have a barbecue down by the river, which is actually a reference to the cover of chapter 1097, where Oda drew a reader request, which was Kuma catching salmon in the river, and he decided to have Jinny having a barbecue with him. And I really like that the anime added this, because when this chapter came out, one of the things I said is that I wish this river scene was canon, and that we got more moments of Jinny and Kuma living their best life together. Although it is a bit unfortunate that Toei didn't go all out and actually animate this scene, I think that would have been very cute and a great excuse for more filler, but referencing this art request and canonizing it was great. But 1131 had another pretty colossal change. Like in this one, I don't know how I feel about it, but it's the scene where Jinny proposes to Kuma. It is so much longer in the anime than it was in the manga, and it is extremely dramatic. In the manga, this scene is played as more of a gag. Yes, Jinny is serious about the proposal, but it's a lot more wacky, and Jinny takes Kuma's refusal a lot more casually. Sort of as if, oh well, you're a dumbass, I'll ask again tomorrow. However, this scene in the anime is crazy dramatic, with the soap opera style music and Jinny on the verge of bursting into tears, and when Kuma tries to change the subject, Jinny clenches her fist in a very angry manner, and then stands there in complete silence with her eyes stylistically blacked out. There is nothing funny happening here. There is so much emotion and so much tension that definitely was not present in the manga, where again, this whole scene is played off as more of a lighthearted gag, with the exception of us seeing why Kuma refused. And again, I'm honestly not sure how I feel about the change. It is a pretty spot-on reaction to having your marriage proposal rejected, but it does make it seem like there is a lot more tension in this relationship than I think there really was. Now, also in episode 1131, we see the Revolutionary Army straight up murder some people when they invade the Sorbet Kingdom to depose King Bakori. We see 3 soldiers getting shot to death, which is an interesting decision. Realistically, I know that the Revolutionary Army does probably kill people because they're an army and they're at war, but as an author, Eiichiro Oda tends to have a policy of not showing his good guys killing people because it makes them cross a moral boundary that Oda would rather not deal with the repercussions of, which is probably why, say for example, Igaram survived his assassination by the many hands of Nico Robin. It should be said that Robin was the only Straw Hat crew member who wasn't planned from day one, so Miss Olsande was probably created as a villain, and when Oda decided he wanted to have her join the crew, he was like, oh no, I need to retcon that whole murder situation. No, Igaram didn't die? What? It's crazy. So look, it's not a huge deal, and I'm sure it's happened before, but the anime showing our alleged good guys shooting people to death is kind of like showing Batman killing people. It just doesn't seem quite right, even if it is a perfectly reasonable solution in the moment. And this is extremely interesting, but next up, we also see the shadow of the person who abducted Jinny, which we definitely do not see in the manga, and it appears to be shaped like a person wearing a cloak. In addition to that, the legs of her captor are much more defined than in the manga, and what is clear from the anime is that Jinny wasn't spotted by a standard world noble and captured on the spot. It's much more likely that this figure is either a cloaked Holy Knight who was sent to abduct Jinny, or possibly even a Cypherpole member. But I feel like Holy Knight is a bit more likely. If it was a Cypherpole agent, you'd have to assume that it was CP0. They're the only ones that act on behalf of the world nobles directly. But CP0 wear these all white outfits rather than the black pants of this figure, which does make me think that, yeah, maybe it was a Holy Knight, which would imply that Jinny's captor was someone even more high up in the world noble hierarchy than we initially suspected. At this stage, all we know for a fact is that it was not Saint Saturn, or at least Saint Saturn claims not to be the person. So I do look forward to the potential of the anime giving us some more clues to work with, and for now, I do think that overall the anime is doing a pretty great job of adapting the manga in this current era. But you let me know what you think in the comments place below. These are the 7 final villains to defeat in One Piece, starting with Fleet Admiral Sakazuki. So as an antagonist, Sakazuki has one of the most impressive CVs of transgressions against our main characters as anyone could in all of media. To name 2 major highlights, he was of course directly responsible for killing Luffy's brother, Podcast Ace, and he was a very active and enthusiastic participant in the genocide of Ohara, the home island of Straw Hat archaeologist Nico Robin. In terms of raw power, Sakazuki may be the single greatest obstacle standing in Luffy's way of becoming the Pirate King. He possesses a uniquely nasty Logia-type devil fruit that allows Sakazuki to conjure, manipulate, and become magma, which the author of One Piece, Eiichiro Oda, has stated has the highest defensive capabilities amongst all devil fruits, not just the Logia class, all devil fruits. The world of One Piece is so large and varied that there exists a tier of characters who may as well be gods. The kind of people that if you encounter them, the only option is to run. Sakazuki is one of these people, which has been proven on multiple occasions, but most notably when even Blackbeard told his entire crew to flee upon discovering that Sakazuki was approaching their location. And to demonstrate exactly why it is that people choose to run, on one occasion Whitebeard, an Emperor of the Sea, and another one of these godlike figures who you have no choice but to run from, decided to clash with Sakazuki, and he got a chunk of his head blown off for his efforts. Recently, Sakazuki also blew off a piece of Bartholomew Kuma's head, but that appears to have been retconned. But what makes Sakazuki an order of magnitude more dangerous than most antagonists has nothing to do with raw power. It's all about how deeply he believes in his philosophy of change for the world. Sakazuki is the figurehead of the absolute justice belief, with a specific sub-focus in thorough justice, meaning that he believes evil will never be eradicated from the world unless you destroy it at the root. It's gotten so extreme that Sakazuki now believes that certain people are born innately evil. For example, if you're the son of a pirate, then you're evil, because you inherited the evil gene from your evil parents, which means that Sakazuki takes no issue murdering children who haven't technically committed a crime yet, and in fact killing them is the preferred outcome because it's getting rid of evil before it has the chance to commit said crime. It's a terrifying mindset, made all the more horrific by the fact that he is currently in charge of the world's largest military force. As Fleet Admiral of the Marines, Sakazuki is a global tragedy waiting to happen, and a prime contender for one of perhaps even the final villain of One Piece. And at the very least, he isn't someone who's going down until the very final arc. And working directly under Sakazuki is Marine Admiral Ryokugyu, known for the sake of ease as Green Bull, because Ryokugyu can be a bit of a tongue twister. But Green Bull is a fairly late game admiral who was drafted into the Marines during the 2-year time skip. And I have no idea where they stumbled upon this dude, but the world government found themselves some solid antagonistic gold here. He's the wielder of another unique type Logia fruit that allows him to conjure, manipulate, and become forests, which is quite troubling because even if you do manage to destroy his body, Green Bull can just grow himself another from any given seed or sapling within this forest, which sounds quite lovely and nature positive. And it's quite twisted really, because every time Green Bull fights, he leaves this beautiful forest in his wake. But of all of the Marine Admirals, I think he's the one I would least want to run into in a dark alley, because Green Bull is also a follower of the absolute justice movement, which is actually very popular within the Marines right now. And while it's often attributed as the philosophy of Fleet Admiral Sakazuki, it was actually first mentioned all the way back in chapter 96 by Vice Admiral John Giant, and it seems like it's an older philosophy, particularly since there are different denominations of absolute justice. Green Bull, for example, practices a subclass known as determined justice, which, if I had to describe it, would be an even more trigger-happy iteration of absolute justice. In the case of most absolute justice followers, they believe that the end justifies the means. They're not necessarily thrilled to carry out the means, but they're always seeking that end. Whereas Green Bull's justice is more about seeking the means, hoping that it maybe somehow will result in an end. He actively believes in the pursuit of subjugation and the systematic imbalance of the world, catering his activities towards facilitating acts of violence and discrimination with the belief that these acts will lead to justice in a manner best described as somehow, which I think is best epitomized in the mantra that he reveals on Wano. Discrimination creates solace, a lovely inspirational quote put on your wall in your workplace. But Green Bull has another quote, because that was stated shortly after he yelled, "You have no human rights. Don't blame me for it. It's how the world works." TLDR, Green Bull is a man without a plan. He's trying to emulate absolute justice without understanding how it actually functions or what it's actually trying to do. He has no intellectual curiosity, and he's more of a justice zealot operating on blind belief, which makes Green Bull quite unhinged and significantly more dangerous, especially in the position of a Marine Admiral, because he holds no logical consistency. He doesn't understand the outcomes of his actions, but he still seeks further actions to do. Much like Sakazuki, the most dangerous thing about about Green Bull isn't his raw physicality, but it's this belief, this strange, questionable belief, which unfortunately, when you boil it down, is a belief in the status quo, meaning that Green Bull will fight with everything he has to maintain the power of the world government, which means that he's going to be a very difficult challenge to overcome in the future. But one of the best things about the One Piece world is that it's a living and breathing world, which means that once beaten, villains don't just up and disappear. No, they endure, and there's one particular group of villains who have come back right at the climax of the series, forming something of a coalition to take one last shot at that sweet, sweet Pirate King dream. And this would be the organization of Cross Guild, featuring 6 members who have been defeated directly by Luffy, being Alvida, Moji, Richie, Galdino, also known as Mr. 3, the former head of Baroque Works, Crocodile, and of course the almighty figurehead of Cross Guild and Emperor over the Sea, Buggy the Clown. It also features 2 members who have been defeated directly by Zoro, being Kabaji and Does Bones, aka Mr. 1. But going in its favor, we have one member who has actually beaten Zoro, being the world's greatest swordsman, Draco Mihawk. So a more accurate name for this group would be the United Federation of Losers, featuring Draco Mihawk. And that last member there is the biggest reason why we're taking Cross Guild seriously in a video like this. There are very few things guaranteed to happen in One Piece, but Zoro will eventually need to fight and defeat Mihawk to claim the title of world's greatest swordsman. Meanwhile, Luffy will need to contend with Buggy, who is now also gunning for the ambition of becoming the Pirate King. And before we rule out Cross Guilds as very serious candidates in this race, let's just consider this. If you add up the bounties of every wanted pirate in Cross Guild, the organization totals 8,848,000,000 berries, which is the highest confirmed crew bounty of any remaining Emperor faction. Straw Hat Pirates, Blackbeard Pirates, Red Hair Pirates, none of them even come close. At the time of this recording anyway, that can and probably will change. But for now, we are taking Cross Guild very, very seriously. But not as seriously as this next final antagonist, a man who has been lurking in the shadows for more than 25 years of publication time, Figerland Garling. So we've only very recently been introduced to the existence that is Figerland Garling. And when it comes to introductions in One Piece, Oda tends to have a very standard method. If a character is particularly important, then they get a fun little standard text box detailing their name, occupation, and maybe bounty, if they're a criminal, that is. But with Figerland Garling, he is particularly special, and he got an entire page of exposition. In the present day, in sacred Marijois, a single celestial dragon had just been executed. The man who passed the sentence was a dominating figure who once distinguished himself at a place called God Valley. Today, he is the supreme commander of the Holy Knights. His name is Saint Figerland Garling. So the Holy Knights are one of 3 private militia who serve the world nobles directly. The most basic would be the private guards, entire squads of which are trained and assigned to each individual world noble. The second would be Cypherpole Zero, who are a private espionage and assassination group containing some incredibly powerful individuals. However, even then, the Holy Knights are on a completely different level and only called upon to deal with the most serious of matters. To give you an example of just how serious one of these situations needs to be to call upon them, the Holy Knights have never been officially mobilized even a single time in all of One Piece to date. Whether it be the Paramount War, the alliance between Big Mom and Kaido, or even the recent Egghead Island incident, the world government has yet to view deploying the Holy Knights as necessary. And despite the fact that there are so few of them, Monkey D. Dragon considers them powerful enough to challenge his entire revolutionary army, with no clear answer on who would emerge victorious. And standing right at the apex of this already apex is Figerland Garling, with Garling's role as Supreme Commander suggesting that he has a higher degree of power and authority than even Fleet Admiral Sakazuki. In fact, politically, Garling has far more authority than Sakazuki because he's entrusted to deal with matters involving world nobles, whereas all that Sakazuki can do is beg before their feet as they demand more and more lobster meals that one time. But Garling is particularly terrifying because he harbors all of the horrendous beliefs and grotesque entitlements of a world noble. However, unlike the vast majority of those useless lumps of meat that are populating Marijois, Garling has the power to back it up. In fact, Garling is significantly more ruthless than your average world noble. From what we've seen thus far, he doesn't really enjoy the standard world noble activity of toying with and humiliating his victims. However, a lot of that may actually be because Garling is so scarily efficient and almost clinical in diagnosing the most painful and appropriate method of ending someone's life, along with the surgical skills as one of the world's greatest swordsmen to to implement a cruel and unusual death upon anyone unfortunate enough to cross paths with him, which was demonstrated when we saw him participate in the God Valley hunt. Garling was so efficiently bloodthirsty that he'd already murdered a whole cohort of innocent victims before the hunt even began. And for this transgression, Garling was punished with a 10,000 point penalty, although once the hunt began, Garling was able to gather 100,000 points with ease, which for the mathematically inclined is a net profit of 90,000 points. We should also talk about Garling's funky aesthetics because it's not just a quirky fashion choice. Garling's hair and beard combination creates a moon, and the first thing to know about One Piece is that sun and moon symbology is everywhere and very, very important. Because we also have another moon-based faction in One Piece, being the Kozuki clan, who were loyal to Joy Boy and likely the Ancient Kingdom. The Kozuki clan were the moon to Joy Boy's sun, they were his vassals, with Vigilant, Garling, and the Holy Knight seeming to represent the moon vassal of the world government. Which means that Garling is both metaphorically and literally standing directly in the way of the dawn of the world prophecy, which will likely never come to fruition so long as he remains breathing. But even then, Garling, he is a mere mini-boss compared to everyone else we have left. Sitting at the very top of the political hierarchy are the 5 Elder Stars: St. J. Garcia Saturn, warrior god of science and defense; St. Marcus Mars, warrior god of the environment; St. Topman Walkuri, warrior god of justice; St. Ethan Baron V. Nasduro, warrior god of finance; and St. Shepherd Jupiter, warrior god of agriculture. Each of whom individually hold more influence over the planets than any faction, and collectively are charged with maintaining a well-calculated stranglehold of power which has lasted for the past 9 centuries. Although we don't know if the 5 elders have been the same people that whole time, but it's not out of the question. Methods of achieving immortality and perpetual youth do exist in One Piece, but what's more troubling is that each of the 5 elders appears to possess a range of demonic powers. Saint Saturn, for example, can transform into a spider yokai-like creature with the ability to freeze people, explode their heads, and near limitless regeneration capabilities in the odd circumstance in which he does incur injury. So because it's One Piece, it's highly likely that this is a devil fruit, perhaps some sort of fancy mythical Zoan. But at the time of this recording, that has yet to be confirmed. He could just flat out be a demon. Whatever it is, it's not unique to Saturn, and each of the 5 elders have their own demonic abilities, which in combination with their truly fearsome intelligence, allow these 5 people to rule the vast majority of the world. And whilst the 5 elders are technically world nobles, I do think that demon is a more appropriate classification, because their desires and depravity trump that of even the most sickening of regular world nobles. They're a living, breathing incarnation of hell on earth that must be eradicated at all costs, but that is significantly easier said than done. And even if you do get rid of them, what goes on to fill that void may be even worse. And a prime candidate for said void fillage would be Emperor of the Sea Marshall D. Teach, better known as Blackbeard. Now don't be fooled by his charming white sort of condom hat that he wore that one time. This man is terror and anarchy incarnate. Blackbeard is the challenge that Oda has been building up throughout all of One Piece. He follows a parallel journey to Luffy, both rising to prominence at around the same time, and now the 2 leading candidates to become the next pirate king. But the most intimidating thing about Blackbeard is that he represents the unknown. Almost everything that Blackbeard's done has taken place off screen. The Level 6 incident, the Payback War, the Rocky Port incident, all of these world-shaking events that he was responsible for, and we know next to nothing about them or him. And what little we do see of Blackbeard only raises more questions to add to the rotund vat of unknown that he is. What we do know is that right now he's the only character capable of wielding 2 devil fruits. We don't know how or why. We also know that he's allegedly never slept in his life. Again, we don't know how or why, but most intriguingly of all, Marshall D. Teach is of course a member of the D Clan. In fact, he's only one of 2 D Clan members we know of who's been described as flat out evil, with the other being the allegedly past Rox D. Whereas every other member of the Will of D works in their own ways to better the world, Marshall D. Teach and Rox D. seem to have a very different, twisted vision of the world, and Blackbeard has almost certainly inherited the will of Rox in this regard, which means that Blackbeard is going to be a very personal opponent for Luffy, because this is set to be the conclusion of a millennia-long civil war within the D-Clan, and it makes the final conflict very complicated, because Blackbeard is no ally of the world government either. In fact, his bounty poster was found ripped up in the Chamber of Flowers on Marijois alongside Luffy's, and the entity responsible for this is the figure currently set up to be the true final boss of One Piece, Saint Emu Nerona. Emu is an enigma amongst enigmas. If you gathered all of the enigmas in a single room, they'd all point to Emu and go, that dude's properly mysterious. There's a concept in One Piece known as the Empty Throne, which is the very foundation of the world government. During the Great War of the Void Century, 20 kingdoms kingdoms came together and pledged their allegiance to an organization that would have no single leader, with the empty throne serving as that symbolism. The idea being to uphold the values of equality. No kingdom, no country, and most importantly, no individual was to be considered more important than another, at least not within the world government itself. Outside of the world government, go crazy. But all of this was a facade anyway, because from its founding 800 years ago to this very day, a single entity has occupied the empty throne and has had sole discretion over every world government decision made between then and now, to the point where even the five elders exist as mere middlemen to carry out Imu's commands. And I'm sure you've all heard this quote before, but I think it's especially appropriate here. The greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing the world that he never existed. And that is exactly what Imu's done. And not only that, but Imu continues to employ this trick to this very day, which was seen most recently when Imu destroyed the Lelucia kingdom, claiming that it never existed. After which point, all record of Lelucia was erased, and even those who do remember the kingdom will never speak out about it in the fear that they will be erased as well. Saint Imu Nerona is the single most powerful individual in One Piece. Imu is the secret final boss who appears out of nowhere once you think the game is over, and the ultimate challenge to overcome in the One Piece world. Meanwhile, your ultimate challenge is much easier, which is to subscribe to this channel for consistent injections of One Piece culture administered directly into your YouTube feed. These are the 21 most wanted individuals in One Piece. And we're not just talking about pirates and revolutionaries here, no, we are combining both bounty systems, which are the wanted criminal bounties issued by the world government that target pirates and revolutionaries, as well as the cross-guild bounty system which exclusively targets marines. Because these days, no one is safe in the One Piece world. And to kick things off, worth exactly 1 billion berries each are two very legendary men, being Jack the Drought and the marine extraordinaire Spardan. Who's Spardan, you ask? Well, don't worry, we'll get to him. But firstly, Jack the Drought is a pirate who once held the title of largest known bounty in One Piece by a wide margin, because when he was first introduced on Zo, Jack's 1 billion made the previous highest known bounty of Ace at 550 million feel woefully insignificant. However, these days, because he's at the beginning of this video, it's definitely Jack who feels rather insignificant. And as for Spardan, he's one of the most recent entries into the Billion Berry Club, as he is a legendary marine who has only appeared in one panel in the series, which was when the cross-guild bounty system was first introduced in chapter 1056. A marine named Spardan appears on a wanted poster, and he is assigned 1 crown, which equates to 1 billion berries. Cross-guild have a flat bounty system where marines are assigned numbers by rank, except in the case of special marines. And Spardan classifies as one of those special marines, because a single crown is not assigned to any individual rank, meaning that this is a man who's made a name for himself and who has commanded the attention of Cross-Guild. We have never met this man, we may never meet this man, but this is a reminder of just how incomprehensibly big the One Piece world is. The idea that there's any number of miscellaneous big shot pirates and marines sailing this world that we just didn't explore extensively enough to find. And they're people that maybe we now should find, because they're worth almost as much as the Straw Hat's very own Vinsmoke Sanji, who is worth an insane 1,032 million berries. This was acquired after defeating Queen during the raid on Onigashima, and it's an increase of 702 million berries over his last bounty of 330 million, which shows that the Marines consider Sanji to be particularly dangerous, because after the raid, most Straw Hat crew members got a flat 300 million increase. Not Sanji though, he was one of the very special few that got given a drastically increased number, and part of this is probably also because they know that Sanji is the biological son of Vinsmoke Judge, and his Germa Kingdom have recently rebelled against the world government. But the number itself is also a reference to Sanji's name, as 3 and 2 can be said as Sanji using Goroase in Japanese, which is again reflected in his birthday March 2nd, which again can be said as Sanji. Meanwhile, the next most valuable man in the world is Charlotte Katakuri, sitting at another staggering number of 1,057 million berries. And Katakuri, of course, has the honor of being the first person that Luffy both fought and defeated with a bounty over 1 billion berries. Quite poignant, as Katakuri's bounty is specifically engineered to show superiority over Luffy. When Luffy fought Katakuri in the Mirror Realm, one of the major themes of the fight was showing Luffy up against someone who could do everything he could but better, and hence why Katakuri has a 57 in his bounty, because Luffy's trademark number is 56, so Katakuri was just that one better. I say was because Luffy has since gone on to completely knock his mochi socks off. And he's not the only Straw Hat either, because former Warlord of the Sea and current Straw Hat helmsman Jinbe sits slightly above Katakuri at 1.1 billion berries, a rather stunning increase from his previous 438 million. million, but this is the result of having a much more longer and more notorious career than his fellow crewmates. Jinbe is 2 decades older than most of the crew, and he was once the right-hand man of Fisher Tiger, who after Goldie Roger and before Monkey D. Dragon was known as the world's most infamous criminal. And as mentioned before, he was also once a warlord of the sea and affiliated with an emperor of the sea, Charlotte Lin. So it's his deep ties and extensive career that have made the world government take him this seriously. But sitting slightly above him, a mere 11 million berries higher than Jinbe, is Straw Hat swordsman Roanoa Zoro, the second most valuable member of the crew and a number that was attained after beating King during the raid on Onigashima. Although Zoro has been on the world government radar for quite some time, longer than Luffy in fact, because Zoro was actually a famous local pirate hunter before becoming a pirate himself. In fact, he's so notorious that to this very day, more people fear him by reputation than they do Luffy. Like Sanji, Zoro's bounty is also a reference to his birthday, 111 or 1111, 11th of November. And when this bounty was revealed, Japan was in shock and awe, not because of how throbbingly large Zoro's number was, but because it was actually misprinted in that edition of Weekly Shonen Jump and reported that his bounty had been changed to 1,111,000 berries, which would actually make him the third lowest bounty in the entire series. Not that Zoro has any problem being in low places. In fact, it's recently become his newfound resolution to become the ruler of the lowest of the low locations as the King of Hell. But any respectful King of Hell needs a bride. Next up, we have the perfect queen. With a body packed full of science and a brain packed full of horrific thoughts, this queen commands a 1.32 billion berry bounty. And a large part of this is because of his affiliation to MADS, an ex-group of notorious scientists who developed cloning and devil fruit recreation, among other things. And among those other things, that as I just said, were a range of extremely deadly plagues, which is Queen's particular area of interest. And if he so chose, Queen could decimate any given island with his hobby viruses, which definitely earns him a place in the Billion Berry Club, but in addition to that, he's just insanely strong and a very chonksome threat to global stability on every level. He's also a dinosaur, which is pretty cool. As our phoenixes, with 1st Division Commander of the Whitebeard Pirates, Marco, weighing in at 1.374 billion berries. A very high number, likely because he was once the right-hand bird of the strongest man in the world. But Marco would almost certainly be in the 2 billion mark at least if he'd won the Payback War and kept the Whitebeard Pirates together as an Emperor of the Sea. Like many characters though, Marco's exact number is more of a pun than a precise indicator of threat, as the 74 in his number can be said as nashi, meaning pear. However, pineapple is written in Japanese with a kanji for both phoenix and pear, so pineapple in Japanese sounds beyond awesome because it's a phoenix pear. And this has been Oda's visual pun all along, as Marco is a phoenix with a pineapple for a head. And Marco is more or less equal to Kaido's right-hand bird King, who commands 1.39 billion units of your attention. And at this stage, you might be thinking, hey man on the internet, something's a bit wrong here, because both King and Queen have higher bounties than Zoro and Sanji. Who defeated them? Why is this for? Well, there is a solid logic to this. As with Queen, we've explored that his scientific knowledge bumps him up as a general threat, but for King, that bump up is because he's the only known member of the Lunarian race still remaining in the One Piece world. The Lunarians are an ancient people who were said to live atop the Red Line before something mass slaughter, and now the world nobles live up there and the Lunarians don't live in general. With the sole exception of King, kind of. The Seraphim use King's Lunarian DNA as part of their makeup, but King himself is considered to be more of a danger to the world government simply because of what he is, and they're willing to pay that much extra simply to rid Lunarians from the world completely. And they're also willing to pay a small fortune for former warlord of the sea Boa Hancock, Empress of Amazon Lily and carrier of a 1.659 billion berries on her head. This is an especially crazy number because when we first met Boa Hancock, her bounty was 80 million berries. Granted, it was frozen because she became a warlord at a very young age, but not a whole lot has really changed since then. Especially because Boa Hancock, unlike most former warlords, didn't have any open hostilities with the world government prior to the warlord dissolution. She really was just minding her own business, but a key reason for this high price is her devil fruit. Boa Hancock uses the Meru Meru no Mi, an ability that can petrify anyone who has a strong feeling about its user, which in Hancock's case is ones that are generally lust. And the key thing about this is that it is completely unblockable. Even with Haki, you try to use it, doesn't work. And there aren't many, if any, other devil fruits that completely bypass Haki. And it's a devil fruit so powersome that Blackbeard started a war with Amazon Lily in an attempt to claim it. Although Hancock's exact berry number again comes from Gorowase, as 659 is a reference to her name, Hakoku, which is about as close as you can get to writing Hancock using purely Japanese numbers. Sometimes with stuff like this, you would be forgiven for thinking that the numbers are a little bit bit arbitrary, because if the Gorowase for Hancock started with a 1 or a 2, then that's what her bounty would end up being, potentially a whole 500 million berries lower, just based on number puns. And we have a similar situation happening with Hancock's fellow former warlord Sir Crocodile, whose 1.965 billion berry bounty contains the word Kuroko, with the 956 doing its absolute best to write the word crocodile. So you can, and I guess I will, make the argument that Crocodile had almost a whole extra billion berries added to his bounty simply because we wanted to spell out the word crocodile. However, what the 1 billion part of his bounty says is that the world government respects Crocodile's intelligence. It's not just because of his personal fight battling power. In fact, it is probably not that at all. I mean, it's alright, but realistically, it's quite lacking compared to most people on this list. But it's because Crocodile has the ability and resources to put together complex, efficient organizations like Baroque Works and Cross Guild that come close to rivaling structures like Emperors of the Sea and causing far more problems for the world government than your average, and you know what, even your exceptional fictional pirates. And speaking of exceptional, next up is a very recent contender in the bounty game, being the accursed Prince of Elbaf, Loki, who clocks in at a rather shocking 2.6 billion berries. This is shocking because at the time of this recording, Loki is neither a pirate or a revolutionary or any sort of criminal, at least not by world government standards. They're not considering him a traditional criminal. The Giants of Elbaf definitely are, because of all of the killing of his father he did. But this is potentially why his bounty has been identified as a, quote, special government bounty, meaning that Loki represents a very unique threat to the world as we know it, and given that his stated goal is to destroy the world, I think that's quite fair, and the world government have recognized that Loki does have a lot of substance required to back up those claims. To put Loki into a bit of perspective, he actually has a higher bounty than Blackbeard originally did when he first became an Emperor of the Sea. After Blackbeard killed Whitebeard, took his world-destroying fruit, and solidified his position as an emperor, the world government still did not see him as a threat greater than Loki. They do now, but we'll get to that. Because we are now entering the top 10 highest known bounties in the One Piece world, and we actually have an unprecedented 7-way tie for 10th place, as Monkey D. Luffy used to skid Trafalgar Law Fujitora, Kizaru, Green Bull, and Monkey D. Garp are all worth 3 billion berries on the dot, which officially makes 3 billion the most common bounty number in all of One Piece. It's so common that we've actually had 2 3 billion berry individuals fight, which were Luffy and Kizaru on Egghead Island. Prior to this, 2 people with the exact same bounty had never fought, because it was almost impossible to find someone with your exact number. But Luffy, Law, and Kid all earned their 3 billion berries by joining forces to defeat Big Mom and Kaido during the raid on Onigashima, whilst our 3 admirals are valued at 3 billion by Cross Guild simply due to their rank. And Garp, well, he's a special case, as Cross Guild see him as such a large threat that Garp's name alone carries that 3 billion berry weight. It shows both respect for the hero of the Marines, but it also acknowledges that his era is over. And we are now in the era of the world being very down to clown, as surpassing Garp, the hero of the Marines and one of the strongest people to have ever lived, is Emperor of the Sea, Buggy the Clown, with 3.189 billion berries. And as a result, Buggy currently holds the record for single largest leap in bounty value, as his number prior to this was 15 million berries. And this leap was granted to Buggy rather intriguingly, partially through his unification of Sir Crocodile, and the next highest number on this list, Rekyul Mihawk, the world's greatest swordsman with a bounty of 3.59 billion berries, which is a pun on his name because 359 can be read as Mikoku, the closest that we can get to Mihawk or Mihoku. But Mihawk is a very special case here because he has the highest bounty assigned to a purely individual operator. Mihawk isn't an emperor, he isn't an admiral, he has no extended forces, he has no information network, he has no allies, he has no other external factors that would usually go into casting a bounty this high. Instead, this number is assigned to Mihawk purely because of raw power alone. And so he is, almost objectively, one of the single strongest figures currently alive on this planet. And mate, it takes a lot of cherry pies to trump Mihawk's number, but this is the work that Marshall D. Teach was willing to put into his now 3.996 billion berry bounty, which he's earned for all of the reasons, including being the primary overall antagonist of One Piece. Even then, I still think he's undervalued and underestimated by the world government, and has been at every stage, which is why Blackbeard has been so consistently enabled to grow both metaphorically and physically, gaining more and more power and more pies. And he's grown so much that he's menacingly edging that 4 billion berry threshold that so few have managed to penetrate, and in fact the only modern day contender to do so is Blackbeard's fellow Emperor of the Sea, Redhead Shanks, with 4,048,900,000 berries. Again, not just a random string of numbers. With these numbers we can make Shiaku, the closest that we can get to Shanks, Shanks. But given that Shanks is only 39 years old, this is a pretty monumental achievement. However, it should be said that he's also been a pirate for all 39 of those years, as he was raised by the former pirate king aboard his vessel. So the nepotism is quite strong here. And part of why Shanks is seen as such a great threat is because he's inherited a huge chunk of Roger's will and legacy, as Shanks is currently the only other known person in this world who can perform Roger's signature attack, Divine Departure, and he is widely considered to be the man closest to finding the One Piece itself and becoming the next pirate king. However, this consideration was only granted after the defeat of two previous emperors of the sea, Charlotte Linlin and Kaido, who were worth 4,388,000,000 and 4,611,800,000 berries respectively. Now, Big Mom and Kaido were both former members of the Rocks Pirates, and ever since Roger's death, they have more or less ruled the New World. However, their rivalry with one another is what has caused them to spend the last almost 3 decades stagnating and ultimately waiting too long to pursue their dreams and being overtaken by the current generation. Their life status is currently unknown. Both of them were blasted into magma, and traditionally, not a lot of people survive that. But if anyone could, I'd say it's these two, or this next guy. In fact, definitely this next guy, who is the current high roller of this new age, being Fleet Admiral Sakazuki, who Cross-Guild have valued at 5 crowns, meaning 5 billion berries, which makes Sakazuki the currently known most valuable living person in the One Piece world. I say living because there is one potential person who could eclipse him, and that would be Monkey D. Dragon, leader of the Revolutionary Army, known as the world's worst criminal, as in he's a good criminal. The best criminal, in fact, he's so good at criming that that's what makes him the worst. And there's a handful of other yet to be revealed figures who would probably crack the top 10, like Silver's Rayleigh or former Admiral Kuzan, but Dragon is the only living character with a chance of surpassing that 5 billion berry mark. Historically, though, we have had 2 other people breach this number. The first is Edward Newgate, aka Whitebeard, who was once known as the strongest man in the world with 5,046,000,000 berries, and of course the legendary Pirate King himself, Goldie Roger, with 5,564,800,000 berries, which again all comes together in Gorowase to form Roshia. But there's more to it than that. Oda has been very, very deliberate with Roger's number, as he's left room for Luffy to ultimately surpass Roger, because Luffy's trademark number, again, is 56, and so it's highly suspected that by the end of the series, Luffy will be on top of this list with a bounty of 5,600,000,000 berries. But we're still a bit away from that, and for now, these are the 21 highest bounties in One Piece held by a total of 28 people.